There is a profound stillness that exists before the first sound of a voice breaks the air. It is a pregnant silence, heavy with potential, like the quiet of a deep valley before a storm, or the hushed atmosphere of a library before a book is opened. Into this world of quiet expectation, in the grey, stone-paved city of Edinburgh, Scotland, a child was born who would eventually weave a web of copper wire across the globe, forever banishing the distance between human voices. But before he became the architect of modern connection, Alexander Graham Bell was simply a boy fascinated by the mystery of how we speak, and perhaps more importantly, how we listen. The Scotland of his youth was a place of mist and cobblestones, where the air was often thick with coal smoke and the chill of the North Sea. Born in 1847, he entered a family where speech was not just a means of communication, but a family trade, a science, and almost a religion. His grandfather, Alexander Bell, was a celebrated elocutionist, a man who could command a room with the precise modulation of a vowel. His father, Alexander Melville Bell, was equally formidable, the creator of a revolutionary system known as visible speech. This system used symbols to map the exact position of the throat, tongue, and lips, allowing anyone to reproduce any sound, even in languages they did not know. It was a tool designed to help the deaf find their voice, a mission that would pulse through the veins of the Bell lineage for generations. Growing up in the shadow of these two imposing Alexanders, the young boy felt a need to carve out his own identity. He was born merely Alexander Bell, a name that felt to him like a hand-me-down suit that didn't quite fit. On his 11th birthday, in a quiet act of self-definition that foreshadowed his later determination, he asked for a middle name as a gift. He chose Graham, after a family friend, finally becoming Alexander Graham Bell, a name with its own rhythm, its own distinct cadence. His childhood was filled with the sounds of experimentation. The Bell household was a laboratory of acoustics, where the young Graham learned to perceive sound as a physical force, a vibration that could be touched and measured. At the age of 15, driven by a mixture of scientific curiosity and mischievous ingenuity, Graham and his brother Melville embarked on a project that bordered on the uncanny. Secure in the attic of their Edinburgh home, they sought to build a machine that could talk. It was a creation of wood, rubber, and wire, a talking automaton that they pieced together with obsessive care. They obtained a replica of a human skull and meticulously crafted vocal cords from stretched rubber. They built a throat and molded lips from gutta percha, a type of rigid latex. The mechanism was powered by a bellows, which forced air through the artificial windpipe. As his brother worked the bellows to simulate the lungs, Graham would manipulate the rubber lips and throat, shaping the escaping air. After weeks of trial and error, adjusting the tension and the flow, they finally succeeded. The skull, with its hollow eyes and mechanical jaw, emitted a distinct, high-pitched cry, "Mama." It was a sound so human, so startlingly real, that it reportedly terrified the neighbours, who believed a child was in distress. For Bell, however, it was not a frightening moment, but an awakening. He had proven that the human voice was a machine, a mechanism of physics that could be replicated, understood, and perhaps transmitted. But the air in Edinburgh was not kind to the Bell family. A dark shadow loomed over their home, the shadow of tuberculosis, the White Plague that claimed lives with terrifying randomness. It took Bell's younger brother Edward and then, only a few years later, his older brother Melville. The house grew silent, the experiments in the attic replaced by the heavy quiet of grief. Graham himself, the last surviving son, began to show the telltale signs of the illness, the fatigue, the weight loss, the pale complexion. His father, desperate to save the last remnant of his legacy, made a drastic decision. They would leave the damp, coal-choked air of Scotland for the open, bracing climate of North America. In 1870, the Bells arrived in Brantford, Ontario. The transition was stark. They moved from the grey, vertical city of Edinburgh to a farmhouse overlooking the Grand River, where the horizon stretched out endlessly and the air was crisp and clean. Here, under the care of the Canadian seasons, Graham's health returned. He spent his days resting in a hammock strung between two birch trees, listening to the wind rustling the leaves, feeling the vibrations of the earth. It was in this pastoral quiet that his mind began to drift back to the problem of sound. He did not set out to invent the telephone. In fact, his great ambition was to solve a problem of capacity. The telegraph, the marvel of the age, could only send one message at a time, a limitation that created bottlenecks in the flowing river of commerce. Bell envisioned a harmonic telegraph, a device that could send multiple messages simultaneously over a single wire. Much like different notes can be played at the same time on a piano without blending into noise, he believed that by using reeds tuned to different frequencies, he could separate the signals at the receiving end. It was this pursuit of the harmonic telegraph that led him to Boston and ultimately to the mistake that changed history. On a humid afternoon in June 1875, Bell and his assistant, Thomas Watson, were working in separate rooms, tweaking the metal reeds of their machine. Watson, frustrated by a reed that had stuck to the magnet, plucked it violently to free it. In the other room, Bell heard something that made him freeze. It was not the simple click of a telegraph signal. It was a twang, a complex, layered sound that carried the timbre of the metal. In that split second, the physicist in Bell realized something profound. An electrical current could model the complex undulations of sound, not just the on-off binary of Morse code. If the wire could carry the twang of a spring, it could carry the complexity of the human voice. The race that followed was frantic. Bell was not the only mind chasing this phantom. Elisha Gray, another brilliant inventor, was running down the same path. The history of the telephone turned on a matter of hours. On February 14, 1876, Bell's lawyers filed the patent for the telephone. Gray's application arrived later that same day. That narrow margin sparked decades of legal battles. Over 600 lawsuits challenged Bell's claim, but he never lost a decisive case. The patent stood, a document that gave legal form to the ethereal concept of speaking across the void. Yet, to understand Alexander Graham Bell, one must look beyond the copper wires and legal briefs. One must look at the women in his life and the silence that surrounded them. Bell's mother, Eliza, was nearly deaf. She would place an ear tube against the piano soundboard to feel the music he played for her. Later, Bell would fall deeply in love with Mabel Hubbard, a student of his who'd lost her hearing to scarlet fever at the age of 5. Mabel was the daughter of a wealthy patron, but to Bell, she was the quiet center of his world. His work was never purely about commerce. It was an act of love, a desperate, lifelong attempt to bridge the isolation of silence. He viewed himself less as an inventor and more as a teacher of the deaf, a title he cherished above all others. This deep entanglement with the deaf community, however, led Bell down complex and controversial paths. His desire to integrate the deaf into the hearing world was so intense that it curdled into a fear of a deaf race. He worried that if deaf people married one another, their isolation would become genetic and permanent. This belief led him to advocate for oralism, the teaching of lip reading and speech at the expense of sign language. He believed sign language isolated the deaf, trapping them in a closed loop, whereas speech opened the door to the broader world. It was a stance born of a desire to help, yet it caused generations of pain, suppressing a rich cultural language in favor of forced assimilation. It remains the complicated shadow of his humanitarian legacy, a reminder that even the most brilliant minds can be blinded by their own convictions. Bell's restless mind could never settle on just one miracle. The telephone, once invented, held little interest for him. In fact, he found it to be a nuisance. In a supreme irony, the man who gave the world the telephone refused to have one in his own study, considering its ringing an intrusion on his thoughts. A thief of his solitude, he preferred the quiet of investigation. This investigation led him into corners of science that few remember. In the sweltering summer of 1881, when President James A. Garfield lay dying from an assassin's bullet, Bell answered the call for help. The doctors could not locate the slug lodged in the president's body. Bell feverishly developed an electromagnetic metal detector, a device that hummed when it neared metal. He brought it to the White House, sweating over the suffering leader, sweeping the wand over Garfield's frame. The device hummed erratically, confusing the doctors and Bell alike. It failed to find the bullet, not because the science was wrong, but because of a variable no one had accounted for. The president was lying on one of the newly invented coil spring mattresses. The metal springs beneath the sheets confused the sensor, rendering the device useless in the moment, though it would later save countless lives in World War I. His empathy extended to individual lives as well. It was Bell who first guided the father of a young, blind and deaf girl named Helen Keller to the Perkins Institution, setting in motion the arrival of Anne Sullivan. Bell and Keller remained lifelong friends, two souls navigating the mysteries of perception. She dedicated her autobiography to him, and he, in a gesture of profound respect, learned to use a Braille typewriter so he could write letters to her directly, bypassing the need for an interpreter, as his beard turned white and bushy, giving him the appearance of a biblical patriarch. Bell's eyes turned toward the sky and the sea. He became obsessed with the problem of flight. Long before the Wright brothers captured the world's attention, he co-founded the Aerial Experiment Association and helped design the Silver Dart, a delicate dragonfly of a machine that made the first powered flight in the British Empire, lifting off the frozen surface of a lake in Nova Scotia. He did not stop there. He wanted to conquer the water as well. He developed hydrofoils, boats that lifted themselves out of the water on wing-like struts to reduce drag. In 1919, his HD-4 hydrofoil roared across the Bras d'Or Lake at over 70 miles per hour, setting a world marine speed record that would stand for a decade. He was a man who refused to accept the limitations of the human body or the physical world. He sought to make the deaf speak, to make metal think, to make heavy boats fly, and to throw the human voice across continents. But all stories, no matter how loud, eventually returned to silence. In August of 1922, at his beloved estate in Nova Scotia, Alexander Graham Bell passed away. He was buried on a hilltop overlooking the water, under the vast open sky he had loved since his arrival in Canada. During his funeral, a tribute was organized that has never been repeated on such a scale. At the exact moment his body was lowered into the earth, the order went out across the massive network he had birthed. In telephone exchanges across the United States and Canada, operators pulled the plugs. For 1 minute, the millions of miles of wire that wrapped the continent went dead. Over 13 million telephones stopped ringing. Conversations ceased. Commerce halted. The hum of the network, the electronic pulse of the modern world, was extinguished. For 60 seconds, the world was returned to the state in which Bell had found it, a place of profound, unconnected silence. It was a silence that honored the man, but it also underscored the magnitude of what had changed. When the minute passed, the plugs were pushed back in, and the hum returned, louder and more complex than before. The world had been stitched together, and the fabric of human intimacy had been altered forever. The voice in the wire had become a permanent ghost in the machine of civilization. As the memory of that momentary silence faded, the current continued to flow, carrying with it not just the voice of the merchant or the cry of the emergency, but the whisper of lovers and the comfort of friends. The wires hummed in the wind, singing a song of connection that began in a Scottish attic with a rubber skull and the boy who wanted to understand the nature of the air itself. And as the sun set over the network of lines crisscrossing the horizon, the world drifted toward a new kind of sleep, one where no one was ever truly out of reach. But before the world could be bound by these copper veins, the mind that conceived them had to be forged in a crucible of sound and silence. To understand the hum of the wire, one must first walk the grey, cobblestone streets of Edinburgh in the middle of the 19th century, where the air was thick with coal smoke and the weight of expectation. Here, in a house filled with the reverberations of the human voice, a boy named Alexander was born into a legacy of speech that would both define and haunt him. He was the middle child, a boy with dark, inquisitive eyes, born into a family where the spoken word was not merely a tool for communication, but a precise and scientific art form. His grandfather, for whom he was named, was a celebrated elocutionist, a man who could command a room with the mere modulation of a vowel. His father, Alexander Melville Bell, was an even more imposing figure, a titan in the study of phonetics who had developed a revolutionary system known as visible speech. The house was a laboratory of articulation. The young Alexander grew up surrounded by strange charts and symbols, curved lines, and jagged strokes that did not represent letters, but rather the physical positioning of the tongue, the lips, and the throat. To the uninitiated, they looked like the ruins of a lost civilization, but to the Bell family, they were a map of human connection. His father taught that if one could mimic the shape of the sound, one could produce the speech, regardless of whether one could hear it. It was a belief rooted in the mechanics of the body, treating the mouth as an instrument that could be tuned like a violin. Yet, the boy felt the heaviness of his name. He was the third Alexander in a line of Alexanders, a small echo in a canyon of booming voices. He longed for a distinction, a syllable that belonged only to him. On his 11th birthday, in a quiet act of self-definition that foreshadowed his later drive for invention, he asked for a new name. He chose Graham, after a family friend he admired. It was his first true invention, Alexander Graham Bell, a name that now carried a rhythm of its own, separating him from the monolithic shadows of his forebears. While his father focused on the mechanics of speech, young Graham became fascinated by the mystery of sound itself. He was a child who listened to the world with an intensity that bordered on obsession, but his most profound lessons in communication came not from the booming lectures of his father, but from the quiet parlour where his mother, Eliza, sat at the piano. Eliza was slowly losing her hearing, a gradual descent into a world of muffled tones. Graham, driven by a fierce and tender empathy, would sit by her feet as she played. He noticed that she did not need to hear the notes to feel the music. She experienced the melody through the vibrations traveling through the wooden floorboards and the casing of the instrument. He developed a way of speaking to her, pressing his lips against her forehead so that the resonance of his voice could travel through her skull, bypassing the damaged ear to reach the mind within. This intimacy with bone conduction, with a tactile reality of sound, planted a seed deep in his consciousness, that the voice was not just air, but energy, a physical force that could be captured, transmitted, and felt. This curiosity soon turned to experimentation. In their teenage years, Graham and his brother Melville, inspired by the family's obsession with the vocal tract, retreated to the attic to build a creature of their own. They sought to construct a talking automaton, a mechanical man that could simulate the human voice. It was a project of macabre ingenuity. They crafted a replica of a human skull, moulding the throat from gutta percha and rubber, meticulously recreating the vocal cords, the hard palate, and the soft tongue. For weeks the attic smelled of heated rubber and sawdust. They built a bellows to serve as the lungs, forcing air through the artificial windpipe, while Graham manipulated the rubber lips and tongue with his dexterous fingers. The result was startling. When they pumped the bellows and adjusted the throat, the skull emitted a high, wailing sound. With careful manipulation, they coaxed it to articulate the word mama. The sound was uncanny, a distressed, human-like cry that reportedly terrified the neighbors who heard it drifting from the window, believing a child was in distress. But for Graham, it was a triumph. He had proven that speech was a mechanical process, a phenomenon of physics that could be replicated by machine. However, the damp, soot-choked air of Scotland held a danger that no machine could speak against. The shadow of tuberculosis, the White Plague, fell upon the house. It first took his younger brother Edward, and then, with cruel speed, his older brother Melville. The house, once filled with the study of breath, became silent, save for the terrible sound of coughing. Graham himself began to show the symptoms: the gauntness, the fatigue, the ominous rattle in the chest. His father, terrified of losing his last remaining son, made a desperate decision. They would flee the glorious, deadly history of Edinburgh for the clean, bracing air of the New World. In 1870, the family arrived in Brantford, Ontario. The transition was absolute. The stone grey of Scotland was replaced by the open, rolling greens of Canada and the high, clear blue of the sky. Here, Graham's health began to return, nourished by long days spent outdoors in a place he called his dreaming place, a hollow nestled among birch trees overlooking the Grand River. It was here, lying in the grass, watching the clouds, that the mind of the inventor began to wander away from the anatomy of the throat and toward the mystery of electricity. He became consumed with the idea of the harmonic telegraph. The world was already wired for telegraphy, but the system was limited, able to send only one message at a time in a series of clicks. Bell, thinking like a musician, theorized that if different messages were sent at different pitches, multiple notes could travel along the same wire simultaneously, like the chords of a piano. It was a brilliant concept, but in pursuing it, he stumbled upon something far more profound. He realized that if a current could be made to undulate, rise and fall in intensity exactly as air density rises and falls when a sound passes through it, then the wire could carry not just a pitch, but the complex timbre of the human voice. This realization was the spark. The telephone was not born of a desire to create a utility. It was born of a desire to replicate the delicate, continuous wave of speech that he had studied on his father's charts. The race to claim this discovery was frenetic. On February 14, 1876, Bell's lawyers filed the patent application for the telephone in Washington, D.C. It was a day of destiny, for just hours later, another inventor, Elisha Gray, filed a caveat for a similar device. The margin of history was razor-thin, a matter of paperwork stamped in the chaotic atmosphere of the patent office. This timing would spawn decades of litigation, over 600 lawsuits that Bell would fight and win. But the true battle was always internal, a struggle to perfect the instrument that would bridge the distances between men. Bell's motivation, however, was never purely commercial. It was inextricably bound to his heart. He had fallen in love with Mabel Hubbard, a brilliant young woman who had lost her hearing to scarlet fever at the age of 5. She was his student, 10 years his junior, and the daughter of the wealthy patent lawyer Gardner Green Hubbard. Bell's love for Mabel was profound. She was his anchor, the quiet center of his chaotic intellect. He wanted to give her the world of sound, or at least to build a world where her silence was not a barrier. Yet, this drive to integrate the deaf into the hearing world had a darker, more controversial undercurrent. Bell, terrified by the isolation he saw in the deaf community, began to advocate for oralism, the suppression of sign language in favor of lip reading and speech. He feared the creation of a death variety of the human race, believing that if deaf people intermarried and congregated, they would become a separate species of humanity. He used his immense influence to ban sign language in schools, a decision that would cause generations of deaf children to be denied their natural language, forcing them to struggle with the mechanics of speech that Bell understood so well, but which many could never master. It was a tragedy born of a misguided desire to fix what he saw as broken, a paradox of a man who loved a deaf woman but feared deafness itself. Despite the global fame the telephone brought him, Bell remained a restless polymath, his mind refusing to settle on one success. In fact, he grew to detest the telephone, refusing to have one in his private study. He viewed the ringing bell as an intrusion, a tyrant that demanded immediate attention and shattered the deep concentration he needed for his work. And what work it was! The man who had conquered the wire soon turned his eyes to the other elements. When President James A. Garfield was shot in 1881, Bell, in a fever of patriotism and scientific duty, invented an electromagnetic metal detector to locate the bullet lodged in the president's body. He worked night and day, listening for the faint hum that would indicate lead. The device worked perfectly in tests, but when applied to the president, it buzzed continuously. The doctors, in their arrogance or ignorance, had placed Garfield on a bed with metal springs, which Bell's device detected, masking the bullet. The failure haunted him, even though the science was sound. His friendship with Helen Keller revealed the softer side of his nature. It was Bell who had first directed her father to the Perkins Institution, setting in motion the chain of events that would bring Anne Sullivan to Helen's side. They remained lifelong friends. The famous inventor, and the woman who lived in the dark and silent world he had spent his life trying to understand. He learned to use a Braille typewriter to correspond with her, tapping out messages of encouragement and affection, proving that connection did not always require a voice. As he aged, his gaze lifted to the sky, and lowered to the water. In the mists of Nova Scotia, at his estate Bray, he became obsessed with flight. Long before the Wright brothers, Bell was experimenting with massive tetrahedral kites, geometric red cells floating against the grey Atlantic sky. He co-founded the Aerial Experiment Association, his white beard blowing in the wind as he oversaw the construction of the Silver Dart, the machine that would achieve the first powered flight in the British Empire. Not content with the air, he sought to conquer the friction of water. He developed the HD-4, a hydrofoil that looked like a ladder turned on its side. In 1919, this strange craft roared across the surface of Brasdor Lake, lifting its hull out of the water and riding on submerged wings, setting a world marine speed record of nearly 71 miles per hour. It was a sight to behold the elderly inventor, the patriarch of sound, skimming the surface of the lake faster than any man had gone before, escaping the drag of the earth, just as he had helped humanity escape the drag of distance. Yet, for all the roaring engines and flying machines, the image that remains is that of the wire. When Alexander Graham Bell finally succumbed to the complications of diabetes in 1922, the world he had connected paid him the ultimate tribute. Every telephone in North America was silenced for 1 minute. The great humming network, now a nervous system spanning a continent, went dead. In that minute, the merchants, the lovers, the bankers, and the mothers held their receivers and heard nothing but the static of the open line. It was a return to the silence of the Scottish attic, a momentary void that reminded the world of what it had been before the Graham was added, before the visible speech, before the voice of the Father had taught the lightning how to speak. But the silence could not hold. The minute passed, the operators plugged the jacks back in, and the hum returned, louder than before. The man was gone, but the vibration he had set in motion was now self-sustaining. The ghost was no longer in the machine. The machine had become the ghost, a permanent, invisible presence that wrapped the globe in a layer of electric thought. And as the sun dipped below the horizon of the 20th century, the legacy of the man who wanted to teach the deaf to speak shifted. The wires were no longer just carrying voices. They were beginning to knit together something new, something vast and incomprehensible. The age of the individual inventor was fading, replaced by the age of the system. The copper threads were waiting for the next pulse, the next evolution, the next mind to come along and ask not just how to send a voice, but how to send a mind itself. To understand the vast humming web that would eventually encircle the earth, one must first unwind the copper spool, pulling the thread back across the Atlantic, back through the decades, to a city of grey stone and swirling mist, before the telephone sat on every desk, before the world became a grid of interconnected voices. There was simply a boy standing in the damp streets of Edinburgh, listening to the peculiar music of human speech. The year was midway through the 19th century, and the boy was Alexander Bell. He was not yet Graham. That came later, a self-bestowed gift on his 11th birthday, a desperate attempt to carve out an identity distinct from the towering figures of his father and grandfather. Both men were named Alexander, and both were titans in the study of elocution. In the Bell household, sound was not merely a way to communicate. It was a physical substance, a science of breath and vibration to be measured, mapped, and mastered. His grandfather, a charismatic elocutionist who would later inspire the character of Professor Higgins in Pygmalion, had made a career of teaching the stammering to speak with clarity. His father, Alexander Melville Bell, had gone even further, inventing a revolutionary system known as visible speech. It was a code of symbols, strange and runic in appearance, that did not represent letters, but rather the physical position of the throat, the tongue, and the lips. To the young Bell, the human voice was a machine made of flesh, a mechanism that could be dismantled and understood. But it was the silence, not the sound, that truly shaped his heart. His mother, Eliza, was slowly retreating into a world of quiet. As her hearing faded, the young Alexander found a unique way to keep the bond between them alive. He would sit at her feet and speak in low, resonant tones directly against her forehead, allowing the bone to conduct the vibrations of his voice into her mind. He learned to play the piano for her, not for the melody, but for the tremors that travelled through the wood and the floorboards, which she could feel with her fingertips. In the quiet intimacy of that Edinburgh parlour, the boy learned a profound truth, that sound was nothing more than touch at a distance, a physical caress of the air against the ear. This fascination with the mechanics of sound led to the creation of the Mechanical Man. It was a project born of youthful curiosity and a touch of the macabre, undertaken with his brother Melville, in the dusty solitude of their attic. They did not want to merely understand speech, they wanted to build it. They acquired a replica of a human skull and set to work with the obsession of anatomists. For the throat, they moulded gutta percha and rubber. For the lungs, they rigged a pair of bellows. They painstakingly arranged the artificial lips and tongue to mimic the positions found in their father's visible speech charts. It was a grotesque assembly of wood, rubber, and bone, a silent effigy waiting for breath. When they finally pumped the bellows and manipulated the rubber throat, the skull did not merely hiss, it cried out. A distinct wailing sound emerged from the lifeless jaw, forming the word mama. It was a sound so human, so pitiful and eerie, that it reportedly sent their neighbours into a panic, convinced that a child was in distress. But for Alexander, the fear was eclipsed by revelation. If a machine of rubber and wood could be made to speak through the manipulation of air, what else might be possible? If the vibration of the air could be replicated by a machine, could it also be carried by something else? The shadow of silence, however, was not done with the Bell family. The fog of Scotland carried with it the damp chill of tuberculosis, the white plague that haunted the lungs of the industrial age. It took one brother and then another. Alexander himself, the last surviving son, began to show the telltale signs, the fatigue, the hollow cough. His father, terrified of extinguishing the family line entirely, made a drastic decision. They would flee the smoke of the cities for the crisp, clean air of the New World. In 1870, the Bells arrived in Brantford, Ontario. They settled on a farm overlooking the Grand River, a place of sweeping vistas and quiet solitude. Here, on the melancholy height of the riverbank, Alexander Graham Bell began to heal. He would take a rug and a pillow down to a hollow in the earth, a dreaming place where he would lie for hours, watching the clouds and thinking about the nature of undulation. He was not, at this stage, trying to invent a telephone. The great goal of the era was the harmonic telegraph. The telegraph wires of the world were clogged with Morse code, limited to one message at a time. Bell believed that by using different pitches like the keys of a piano, he could send multiple messages simultaneously over a single wire. It was a musical solution to an engineering problem, but the mistake is often the father of the miracle. One afternoon, while tuning the metal reeds of his telegraph apparatus with his assistant, Thomas Watson, a reed plucked in one room caused a sympathetic vibration in another. It was not a click or a dot. It was a tone. In that instant, Bell realized that the electrical current was not just an on-off switch. It could undulate. It could ripple like water, mirroring the complex waves of sound. The theory of the variable resistance was born. The voice, he realized, could be transformed into electricity, sent along a wire, and reconstituted as sound on the other end. The race that followed was frantic. On February 14, 1876, Bell's lawyers filed the patent for the telephone. Just hours later, Elisha Gray, a rival inventor working on a similar concept, filed a caveat. The margins of history are often measured in minutes. Bell had won the legal claim. Sparking a lifetime of litigation over 600 lawsuits would challenge his priority. But he never lost a single major case. The patent, number 174,465, became one of the most valuable documents in history. Yet, as the telephone began its conquest of the world, Alexander Graham Bell remained a man of paradox. He had created the device that would define the modern era, yet he viewed it with a strange detachment, even disdain. In his later years, he refused to have a telephone in his own study. He considered its ringing an intrusion, a rude interruption of his thoughts. a tyrant of his own making that demanded immediate attention. His heart remained tethered to the silence he had sought to cure. His wife, Mabel Hubbard, had lost her hearing to scarlet fever at the age of 5. His love for her was the emotional engine of his life, a love that transcended spoken language. He did not view himself primarily as an inventor of gadgets, but as a teacher of the deaf. It was Bell who advised the father of a young Helen Keller to seek help at the Perkins Institution, setting in motion the chain of events that would unite Helen with Anne Sullivan. Bell and Keller remained lifelong friends, two minds communicating across the void of silence, with Bell even learning to use a Braille typewriter to write her letters. But this passion had a darker, more complex dimension. Bell was a man of his time, and his obsession with normalcy led him down controversial paths. He feared that the formation of deaf communities and the use of sign language would isolate the deaf from the rest of society, leading to what he termed a deaf variety of the human race. He became a staunch advocate of oralism, the banning of sign language in favor of lip reading and speech. It was a philosophy born of a desire to integrate, but it resulted in the suppression of a rich and vibrant culture, a stance that remains a complicated scar on his legacy within the deaf community today. He wanted to give the deaf a voice, but in doing so, he tried to take away their hands. His mind, however, was a restless hunter, never content to stay in one field. The man who conquered sound soon turned his eyes to other impossible barriers. In the summer of 1881, when President James A. Garfield was shot by an assassin, the nation held its breath as doctors failed to locate the bullet lodged in the president's back. Bell, moved by the tragedy, worked feverishly to invent a solution. He created an induction balance, an early form of the metal detector designed to hum when passed over lead. He brought the device to the president's bedside. The machine hummed, but it hummed everywhere. The doctors, in their ignorance, had placed the president on a bed with coiled metal springs beneath the mattress, a new luxury at the time. The springs confused the machine, rendering it useless. The bullet remained found only by the infection that eventually claimed the president's life. It was a bitter failure for Bell, a reminder that science is always at the mercy of circumstance. As his hair turned white and his beard grew into a flowing mane, Bell's imagination lifted from the earth entirely. He became obsessed with the problem of flight. Years before the Wright brothers, Bell was experimenting with enormous tetrahedral kites, geometric structures of red silk and wood that looked like alien crystals floating above the green hills of his Nova Scotia estate, Bainbray. He co-founded the Aerial Experiment Association, guiding the team that built the Silver Dart, the thirst-powered aircraft to fly in the British Empire. And when the air was not enough, he turned to the water. He despised the friction that held ships back. He wanted to lift the hull out of the waves, to make a boat that could fly on the surface of the sea. His HD-4 hydrofoil, a cigar-shaped vessel that looked more like a torpedo than a boat, roared across the Brazos Lake, setting a world marine speed record of nearly 71 miles per hour in 1919. It was a terrifying speed for the time, a blur of spray and noise that proved the old man's mind was still racing faster than the world could catch him. Yet, despite the roar of engines and the hum of wires, the image that remained was of the solitary figure by the river. The boy who listened to the piano through the floorboards, the man who pressed his lips to his mother's forehead. The inventor who built a mechanical throat to scream "Mama" into the void. His life was a testament to the human need to bridge the gap between one mind and another. He saw the world as a system of vibrations, a great trembling web where every thought and every sound could be caught and transmitted. He had turned the metal of the earth into a nervous system for humanity. When he finally passed away at his estate in Nova Scotia in 1922, the world he left was fundamentally different from the one he had entered. He had found it silent and vast, separated by distance and time. He left it shrinking, knit together by the copper threads of his own design. On the day of his funeral, the order went out. At 6:25 p.m. Eastern Time, the entire telephone network of the United States and Canada was shut down. For one full minute, the hum stopped. 13 million telephones ceased to ring. The operators pulled their hands from the switchboards. Conversations were cut mid-sentence. The flow of commerce, of gossip, of tragedy and news was severed. In that 60 seconds of manufactured silence, the world was reminded of what it had been before him. The silence was heavy, almost deafening in its intensity. It was a tribute of absence, a global pause to honor the man who had destroyed isolation. But the silence could not last. It was unnatural now. The minute ticked by, a heartbeat of quiet in a noisy century. And then, as the second hand crossed the threshold, the operators plugged the jacks back in. The connection was restored. The hum returned, rising from the silence like a great intake of breath. The mechanical man was gone, but the machine he had built was now alive, breathing with the voices of millions, a permanent electric immortality that would never sleep again. And somewhere within that wire, within that ceaseless vibration, the ghost of the boy from Edinburgh still lingered, listening, always listening, to the music of the spheres. This was the legacy of the vibration. But wires were only the beginning, for as the 20th century marched onward, the hunger for connection would not be sated by voice alone. The air itself was waiting to be conquered. The copper threads had tethered the world, but there were those who looked up, beyond the poles and the cables, imagining a way to cast the voice without the wire, to let it drift on the wind like pollen. The age of the radio was stirring in the ether, waiting for its own masters to step forward from the shadows. The ether was indeed stirring, but long before the radio waves would dance upon the wind. The architecture of human connection was being drafted in the mind of a young Scotsman who lived in a house filled with both profound noise and profound silence. To understand the wire that wraps the world, one must first walk the grey, cobbled streets of Edinburgh in the middle of the 19th century, where a boy named Alexander was learning that the voice was not merely a sound, but a physical force, a tangible thing that could be moulded, measured, and perhaps even manufactured. He was born into a legacy of tongues. His grandfather was a celebrated elocutionist, a man who treated the English language like a musical instrument, and his father, Alexander Melville Bell, was the architect of visible speech, a system of symbols so precise it could map the position of the lips and tongue for any sound in human speech. The young Alexander grew up watching his father sketch the geography of the mouth, turning the invisible breath into ink on paper. But he felt the weight of his name, shared by both father and grandfather. A heavy mantle of expectation. He was on his 11th birthday, seeking to carve out a singular identity from the family tree, that he adopted the middle name Graham, a gift he bestowed upon himself to honour a family friend, signalling an early desire to be distinct, to be his own man. This desire for distinction manifested in strange, somewhat macabre ways. As a teenager, possessed by a curiosity that bordered on obsession, Alexander and his brother retreated to the shadows of their workshop to build a life from scratch. They did not use clay or magic, but wood, rubber, and air. They constructed a talking automaton, a mechanical replica of a human skull. They stretched rubber over the throat to simulate vocal cords and attached a bellows to force air through the artificial windpipe. It was a crude Frankensteinian creation, but when they pumped the bellows and manipulated the rubber lips, the skull let out a cry. It wailed the word mama with such terrifying human realism that the neighbours, hearing the disembodied voice floating from the bell house, feared that a child was in distress. It was Alexander's first telephone, though it had no wires, only the raw mechanical mimicry of life. But the breath of life is fragile, a lesson Alexander learned with devastating cruelty. The damp, soot-stained air of Britain carried the White Plague, tuberculosis which swept through the Bell household like a silent thief. It claimed his younger brother Edward and then his older brother Melville. Alexander himself, the last surviving son, began to cough, the shadow of the disease darkening his own lungs. Desperate to save their family line from total extinction, his father uprooted them, fleeing the sick air of Scotland with the crisp, bracing winds of Canada. They settled in Brantford, Ontario in 1870, where the open spaces and clean oxygen allowed Alexander to recover. It was there, in the quietude of the Canadian countryside, that the young man's mind turned inward. He became obsessed with the idea of the harmonic telegraph. The telegraph was the master of the age, but it was limited: one message, one wire, dot and dash. Bell believed that if sound was vibration, then multiple notes could travel along the same string simultaneously, like the chords of a piano. He did not set out to invent the telephone. He set out to improve the telegraph. The telephone was a beautiful accident, a mutation of his original intent. It was while listening to the plucking of steel reeds, hearing the faint ghostly overtones carried through the electrical current, that he realized the wire could carry more than just a tone. It could carry the complex, undulant shape of a voice. Yet, behind the mechanics of the reed and the battery, there lay a deeper, more personal motivation. Alexander Graham Bell was a man who lived on the borderland of silence. His mother, Eliza, was nearly deaf, capturing the world through an ear tube and the vibrations she could feel through the floorboards. Later, the great love of his life, Mabel Hubbard, would also be a woman of silence. She had lost her hearing to scarlet fever at the age of 5. Bell did not view his invention primarily as a business tool, but as a bridge across the chasm of isolation. He was, first and foremost, a teacher of the deaf. He courted Mabel with the same intensity he applied to his experiments, and she became his anchor. However, this deep connection to the deaf community carried a complex, darker undercurrent. Bell's brilliance was matched by a rigid, controversial philosophy. He feared the formation of what he called a death variety of the human race. He believed that if deaf people married one another, they would propagate deafness, a genetic outcome he sought to prevent. This belief led him to champion oralism, the teaching of lip reading and speech over sign language. He argued that sign language isolated the deaf from the wider world, and in doing so, he used his immense influence to suppress the natural language of the deaf community, a stance that would leave a scar on his legacy for generations. He was a man who wanted to give voice to the voiceless, yet paradoxically tried to silence the language of their hands. The race to capture the voice in a wire culminated in one of the most famous coincidences in patent history. On February 14, 1876, Bell's lawyers filed the patent for the telephone. Just hours later, a rival inventor named Elisha Gray filed a caveat for a similar device. The timing was razor-thin, a matter of mere moments in the grand sweep of history, leading to over 600 lawsuits in the years that followed. But Bell stood firm. He had the notes, the dates, and the relentless drive of a man who felt destiny at his back. He never lost a major case. As the telephone began to weave its copper web across the continents, Bell himself began to drift away from it. He found the device intrusive. In a supreme irony, the man who gave the world the ability to interrupt one another at any distance refused to have a telephone in his own study. He considered its ringing a jagged intrusion on his thoughts, a demand for attention that shattered the delicate flow of his scientific reverie. He preferred the silence he had spent his life trying to fill. His mind, restless and uncontainable, moved on to other mysteries. In the summer of 1881, the nation held its breath as President James A. Garfield lay dying, an assassin's bullet lodged somewhere in his body. The surgeons, blind and desperate, probed the president's wounds with unwashed fingers, unable to locate the lead. Bell, moved by the national tragedy, threw himself into a feverish invention process. He developed an electromagnetic metal detector, a device designed to hum when it passed over the metal bullet. He brought it to the White House, sweating in the oppressive Washington heat, and passed the wand over the president's body. The machine hummed, but it hummed everywhere. The signal was confused, muddled by a ghost in the static. It was only later, after the president had succumbed to infection, that Bell realized the failure was not in his mind, but in the bed. The president had been lying on one of the newly invented coil spring mattresses, and the metal springs beneath the sheets had confused the detector. The invention worked, but the environment had failed it. As his beard whitened and his fame grew, Bell retreated to his estate, Bain Bray, in Nova Scotia. Here, surrounded by the waters of the Bras d'Or Lake, He looked away from the earth and toward the sky and the sea. He became a mentor to Helen Keller, the blind and deaf woman who would become a global icon of resilience. It was Bell who had first directed her father to the Perkins Institution, leading her to Anne Sullivan. They remained lifelong friends, connected by the Braille typewriter Bell learned to use, tapping out messages to her in the darkness. In his final years, the man of wires became a man of wings and waves. He founded the Aerial Experiment Association, obsessed with the problem of flight. Under his guidance, the Silver Dart was constructed, a fragile dragonfly of wood and fabric that achieved the first powered flight in the British Empire, lifting off the frozen surface of the lake. But the air was not enough. Bell wanted to walk on water. He developed the HD-4, a hydrofoil boat that looked like a cigar suspended on ladders. In 1919, with engines roaring, the vessel lifted out of the water, riding on its foils at over 70 miles per hour, setting a world marine speed record that would stand for a decade. The old man, hair blowing in the wind, was still chasing the vibration, still pushing against the limits of the physical world. But the ultimate silence waits for every man, even the one who conquered distance. In August of 1922, at his beloved estate in Nova Scotia, Alexander Graham Bell lay dying. He was 75 years old. The complications of diabetes had weakened him, and as the light faded from the room, his wife Mabel, the woman for whom he had sought to bridge the silence, held his hand. She whispered to him, "Don't leave me." Unable to speak, he traced the sign for "no" in the air with his fingers, a final communication in the language of the death, a silent promise breaking through the noise of history. And then the breath stopped. The vibration ceased. 2 days later, during his funeral, the world offered a tribute unlike any before or since. At the exact moment his body was lowered into the earth, a signal went out across the network he had birthed. In telephone exchanges across the United States and Canada, operators pulled the plugs. Every phone rang silent. For 1 full minute, the great humming web of 13 million telephones went dead. The conversations of commerce, the whispers of lovers, the orders of generals, and the gossip of neighbors, all of it was severed. The world, which had forgotten how to be quiet, was plunged back into the silence from which Bell had emerged. It was a global pause, a collective holding of breath, honoring the man who had ended isolation. In that minute of silence, the ghost of the mechanical man, the hum of the harmonic telegraph, and the roar of the hydrofoil all vanished. There was only the wind, blowing through the wires, waiting for the connection to be restored. And when the minute passed, the plugs were pushed back in. The hum returned. The network awoke, hungrier than before, for the silence had only sharpened the appetite for sound. But the wire was heavy, and the poles were rooted in the earth. The dreamers who had watched Bell's kites and hydrofoils knew that the next frontier was not in the ground, but in the air itself. The silence that Bell had briefly commanded during his funeral was thick with potential, a medium waiting to be filled, not by copper, but by waves. Far away from Nova Scotia, in labs filled with sparking coils and vacuum tubes, a new generation of wizards was watching the invisible spectrum. They saw that the voice did not need a wire to travel. It needed only the courage to leap into the void. The atmosphere was charged, static, clinging to the skin of the world, and in the quiet aftermath of the telephone's tribute, the faint crackle of the wireless age began to assert itself. The legacy of the vibration had been secured, but the method of its delivery was about to change. The ground had been conquered. Now the sky was listening. The era of the point-to-point conversation was ending, and the era of the broadcast, the voice thrown to the multitudes, was drawing its first electric breath. The silence was over. The air was about to speak. But before the air could speak to the multitudes, the wire had to learn to whisper to the one. Long before the sky was filled with invisible frequencies, the conquest of silence began in the grey, cobblestoned embrace of Edinburgh, Scotland, within the mind of a boy who was intimately acquainted with the absence of sound. Alexander Bell was born into a world of voices, yet he was destined to live his life on the periphery of silence. His lineage was one of orators and speech correctors. His grandfather, a man of booming charisma, was a celebrated elocutionist who could command a room with the mere modulation of a vowel. His father, Alexander Melville Bell, was a scholar of the throat and tongue, the inventor of a system known as visible speech. This was a map of the human mouth, a series of symbols that instructed the deaf on exactly how to position their lips and teeth to produce sounds they could not hear. In the Bell household, sound was not merely a sensory experience. It was a tangible structure, something to be dissected, analyzed, and engineered. Yet the young Alexander felt the weight of his own name pressing down upon him. He was the third Alexander in a line of Alexanders, a repetition of identity that stifled his spirit. He longed for distinction, for a vibration that was uniquely his own. It was on his 11th birthday that he gifted himself a new identity, adopting the middle name Grum in honor of a family friend. It was a small act of rebellion, a young boy tuning his own frequency, ensuring that when the world spoke his name, it would ring with a specific, singular resonance. Alexander Graham Bell. His fascination with the mechanics of speech soon moved from the theoretical to the grotesque. In the dim light of their shared bedroom, Alexander and his brother Melville embarked on a project that hovered between science and sorcery. They sought to build a mechanical man. They scavenged for materials, constructing a replica of a human skull. They fashioned vocal cords from stretched rubber, cheeks from soft cotton, and a throat from tin. A pair of bellows served as the lungs, forcing air through the artificial larynx. When they finally activated the device, manipulating the rubber lips with their fingers while pumping the bellows, the skull emitted a sound that was both miraculous and terrifying. It cried out, "Mama." The neighbors, hearing the wail of a child where no child existed, were reportedly struck with a primitive fear. But for Alexander, it was not fear, but revelation. If a construct of rubber and tin could mimic the human soul's cry, then speech was nothing more than the manipulation of air, a series of undulations that could be replicated, transported, and perhaps mastered. But the air of Scotland was heavy with more than just fog. It carried the damp, clinging spore of tuberculosis. The White Plague swept through the Bell family with ruthless efficiency. It took his younger brother, Edward, and then, only a few years later, it claimed his older brother, Melville. Alexander himself, the last surviving son, began to waste away, his tall frame thinning, his complexion turning the pale grey of the Edinburgh sky. His father, terrified of extinguishing his line completely, made a desperate decision. They would flee the damp of the old world for the crisp, bracing air of the new. In 1870, the family arrived in Brantford, Ontario. The transition was stark. Here, the air was sharp and clean, smelling of pine and river water. Alexander, recovering his strength in the dreaming place of his parents' new home, would spend hours lying on the bluffs overlooking the Grand River. It was here, in the quietude of the Canadian wilderness, that his mind began to drift away from the mechanical skull and toward the nature of electricity. He was not initially trying to invent the telephone. That device, which would eventually bind the world in a web of copper, was a mistake, a deviation from his true pursuit. Bell was obsessed with the harmonic telegraph. The telegraph lines of the world were clogged with traffic, able to send only one message at a time. Bell believed that if he could send different musical pitches along the same wire, he could transmit multiple messages simultaneously, like the chords of a piano traveling down a single string. It was a musical problem. And Bell, a pianist who could sense the vibration of the keys even when he couldn't hear the note perfectly, understood music. But his research led him deeper into the nature of sound waves themselves. He realized that the human voice was not a simple on-off signal like the telegraph's Morse code. It was a complex rolling wave and undulation. To transmit it, the electrical current would have to mimic that wave perfectly. On a hot afternoon in June 1875, the breakthrough came not with a shout, but with a twang. In his Boston workshop, Bell's assistant, Thomas Watson, was plucking a stuck reed on a transmitter. In the other room, Bell heard the sound, not as a click, but as the distinct, complex vibration of the reed itself. The current had carried the timbre of the metal. The wire had conveyed the shape of the sound. The race that followed was one of the most dramatic in the history of invention. On February 14, 1876, Bell's lawyers filed the patent for the telephone. Just hours later, Elisha Gray, a rival inventor working on a similar concept, filed a caveat for a variable resistance transmitter. The margin of victory was razor-thin, a matter of timestamps and clerical swiftness. It would lead to over 600 lawsuits in the decades to come, a storm of litigation that Bell would weather with a stoic detachment. He often found the battles tedious. He had already moved on to the next question. For Bell, the telephone was never merely a commercial enterprise. It was a bridge across the abyss of isolation. His life was inextricably bound to the world of the deaf. His mother, Eliza, had lost her hearing in childhood. Bell would often sit at her feet while she played the piano, pressing his ear against the resonance board to hear the vibrations she felt through her fingertips. Later, he would fall deeply in love with Mabel Hubbard, a student of his who had been deaf since the age of 5 due to scarlet fever. Mabel was his anchor and his muse. She was the silence that balanced his noise. It was for her and for his mother that he sought to understand the architecture of communication. He viewed his work as a scientist as secondary to his true vocation, a teacher of the deaf. He wanted to bring them into the world of speech. However, this benevolence carried a shadow, a complexity of thought that history views with a more critical eye. Bell was a man of his time, and his obsession with heredity and genetics led him down darker paths. He feared the creation of a deaf variety of the human race. He worried that if deaf people married one another, their isolation would become genetic and permanent. This fear drove him to advocate for oralism, the suppression of sign language in favor of lip reading and speech. He believed he was liberating the deaf from a closed society, forcing them to integrate into the hearing world. He could not see from his vantage point that he was also attempting to erase a rich, vibrant culture of signs, a language of the hands that possessed its own poetry and power. It was the paradox of the man. He gave the world a device to connect across distances, yet sought to dismantle the natural connection of those closest to him. Even as the telephone began to ring in parlors and offices across the globe, transforming the texture of modern life, Bell found himself retreating from it. He refused to keep a telephone in his own study. He famously covered the device with a blanket or stuffed it with paper to silence its bell. To the man who had birthed it, the telephone was an intrusion, a thief of solitude. He resented the immediacy of it, the way it demanded attention, the way it collapsed the necessary distance between thoughts. He had conquered silence, only to find that he missed it. His mind, restless and uncontainable, drifted to other elements. If sound could travel through wire, what could travel through water? What could travel through air? When President James A. Garfield was shot in 1881, the nation held its breath as doctors probed for the bullet lodged in his back. Bell, moved by the tragedy, turned his laboratory into a frenzy of invention. He developed an electromagnetic metal detector, a device designed to hum when it encountered lead. He brought it to the president's bedside, desperate to save the leader. But the device hummed erratically, confused and useless. Bell left in despair, not knowing that the doctors had placed the president on a thoroughly modern innovation, a mattress with steel coil springs. The bed itself had blinded the machine. Bell's later years were spent not in the city, but at his estate, Bainbray in Nova Scotia. Here, the white-bearded patriarch turned his eyes to the sky. Long before the Wright brothers captured the world's attention, Bell was experimenting with massive tetrahedral kites, geometric honeycombs of red silk and wood that looked like alien structures floating above the Bras d'Or. He dreamed of flight, of machines that could lift a man from the surface of the earth. He founded the Aerial Experiment Association, mentoring young engineers and helping to construct the Silver Dart, the first powered aircraft to fly in Canada. He moved from the air to the water, obsessed with speed and friction. He designed hydrofoils, boats that rose up on submerged wings to skip across the waves like skipping stones. In 1919, His HD-4 roared across the lake at over 70 miles per hour, a speed that seemed impossible for a vessel on water, leaving a wake of white foam and baffled onlookers. He was a man who could not stop asking, "What if?" He corresponded in Braille with Helen Keller, having been the first to suggest to her father that she could be taught, leading her to Anne Sullivan. Keller, who lived in a world of profound silence and darkness, found in Bell a kindred spirit, a man who understood that vibration was the touch of the universe. She dedicated her autobiography to him, the man who had opened the door, but all frequencies must eventually fade. In August of 1922, the diaphragm of Alexander Graham Bell's own heart finally came to rest. He died at his beloved estate in Nova Scotia, surrounded by the cool northern air that had once saved his life. The tribute that followed was unlike any the world had ever seen or heard. It was a monument not of stone, but of time. During his funeral, the order was given. In every exchange, in every switching station across the United States and Canada, the operators pulled their hands from the boards. For 1 solid minute, the hum of the network ceased. 13 million telephones went dead. Conversations were suspended in mid-sentence. Business halted. The copper web that wrapped the continent, usually alive with the chattering pulse of millions of lives, fell into a profound artificial slumber. It was a global breath held in reverence. The teacher of silence was honored with the very thing he had spent his life trying to bridge. And in that 60 seconds of quiet, the world realized just how loud it had become. Yet, as the operators plugged back in and the roar of civilization resumed, the silence did not truly vanish. It had merely migrated. The wires were full, but the space between the wires, the vast atmospheric ocean of the sky, was beginning to ripple. Bell had proven that the voice was energy, and energy does not like to be tethered. The copper cables were only the beginning, a training wheel for a civilization learning to speak. The true medium was waiting, invisible and omnipresent, ready to carry the next great signal, not point to point, but point to infinity. The ground had spoken. Now the ether was preparing to sing. To understand the song of the ether, we must first descend from the vastness of the global network and return to the misty, cobblestoned quiet of Edinburgh in the middle of the 19th century, before the world was wrapped in copper. Before the voice could travel faster than the wind, there was a boy who was obsessed not with the machinery of the world, but with the machinery of the throat. The story of the telephone does not begin with electricity. It begins with breath, with the delicate vibration of air passing through a chamber of flesh and bone. Alexander Bell was born into a legacy of sound, though he spent much of his early life listening to the silence that surrounded it. His family was a dynasty of elocutionists, men who had dedicated their lives to the art of speaking. His grandfather, a commanding figure with a mane of white hair, was famous for his booming voice and his ability to recite Shakespeare with a precision that could bring a crowded theatre to a standstill. His father, Alexander Melville Bell, had gone even further, inventing a system known as visible speech. It was a strange and beautiful alphabet, not of letters, but of diagrams, intricate symbols that mapped the exact position of the tongue, the lips, and the palate required to make any sound humanly possible. To the young Bell, speech was not magic, it was architecture. It was a physical act that could be drawn, studied, and engineered. Yet, amidst this empire of oration, the young Alexander felt himself fading into the background. He was the middle child, sandwiched between two brothers, all three named Alexander, all three expected to carry the torch of the family voice. He felt like a shadow in a house of echoes. On his 11th birthday, in a quiet act of self-definition, he asked his father for a gift that could not be bought in any shop. He asked for a name. He chose Graham, after a family friend, adding a distinct rhythm to his own identity, Alexander Graham Bell. It was his first invention himself. This desire to distinguish the voice from the person, to separate the sound from the soul, drove him to strange and fascinating experiments. As a teenager, fueled by his father's challenge and his own curiosity, He and his brother retreated to the attic to build a creature of their own. It was not a monster of flesh, but a simulation of life. They constructed a talking automaton, a mechanical replica of the human head. They carved a skull from gutta-percha and wood, molding the jaw to hinge and the lips to stretch. Inside, they placed a larynx made of rubber and a windpipe connected to a bellows that could force air through the artificial throat. It was a meticulous reconstruction of anatomy. When they pumped the bellows and manipulated the rubber lips, the machine let out a cry. It was a high, faltering sound, crying out, "Mama! Mama!" with such startling realism that the neighbours in the flat below were convinced a child was in distress. In that attic, amidst the sawdust and the smell of rubber, Bell realized a profound truth. The voice was merely a vibration. If a machine of wood and rubber could weep for a mother it did not have, then sound was nothing more than a physical force, a wave that could be captured, measured, and perhaps transmitted. But the voice of the Bell family was destined to be silenced by a tragedy far quieter and more devastating than any machine. The damp, soot-stained air of British cities carried the white plague tuberculosis. It moved through the lungs of the population like a slow tide. It took Bell's younger brother, Edward, first. Then the sickness turned its gaze to his older brother, Melville. The house that had been filled with the study of speech became a house of hushed whispers and stifled coughs. By the time Bell was 23, both his brothers were dead, and he himself was pale, gaunt, and coughing, the shadow of the plague lengthening over his own chest. His father, desperate to save the last remaining fragment of his lineage, made a decision born of panic and hope. He packed up the family and the remnants of their life and fled across the ocean to the crisp, clear air of Canada. They settled in Brantford, Ontario, at a homestead they called Two-Teller Heights. Here, the air was sharp and clean, smelling of pine and river water rather than coal smoke. The landscape was vast, open, and silent. It was in this healing silence that Bell's mind began to wander back to the nature of sound. He would spend hours lying on a blanket on the bluff overlooking the Grand River, watching the currents of the water and thinking about the currents of electricity. He knew the telegraph wires could carry a signal, a simple click-clack of Morse code. But he began to dream of something more complex. He dreamed of a harmonic telegraph. The telegraph lines of the 1870s were congested, able to send only one message at a time. Bell theorized that if he could send different musical notes along the same wire like the chords of a piano, he could transmit multiple messages simultaneously, each tuned to a different pitch. It was a musical solution to an industrial problem. He wasn't trying to invent the telephone. He was trying to invent a choir of telegraphs. But as he tinkered in his workshop, first in Ontario and later in Boston, the boundaries between the musical note and the human voice began to blur. He worked with a young machinist named Thomas Watson, a man with hands capable of building the delicate instruments Bell's mind conceived. They spent endless nights in a clutter of wires, magnets, and diaphragms, chasing the elusive harmonic signal. The breakthrough did not come as a thunderclap of genius, but as a subtle shift in perception. On a humid afternoon in June, while tuning the metal reeds of their receiver, a reed stuck. Watson plucked it to free it, and the metal strip vibrated, inducing a current that travelled down the wire. In the other room, Bell heard it. Not a click, but a twang. It was a complex sound, a sound with timbre and tone. In that single, vibrating moment, the harmonic telegraph died, and the telephone was born. Bell realized that if a wire could carry the complex vibration of a plucked reed, it could carry the infinitely more complex vibration of the human voice. He called it undulating current, a flow of electricity that rose and fell in perfect sympathy with the waves of the air. The race to claim this discovery was one of the most razor-thin margins in the history of invention. On Valentine's Day, 1876, Bell's lawyer filed the patent for the telephone at the U.S. Patent Office. Mere hours later, on that very same day, Elisha Gray, a rival inventor working on a similar concept, filed a caveat for a telephone design. History turned on the pivot of a ticking clock. Those few hours granted Bell the legal supremacy over the most valuable patent ever issued, sparking a lifetime of litigation. Over 600 lawsuits would be launched against him, a legal storm that raged for decades, yet the courts consistently upheld that Bell was the first to harness the undulating current. But for Bell, the telephone was not purely a matter of patents or profits. It was deeply, achingly personal. His life was defined by the silence of the women he loved. His mother, Eliza, had been hard of hearing for most of his life, listening to him through a rubber tube he would speak into. And then there was Mabel. Mabel Hubbard had lost her hearing to scarlet fever when she was 5 years old. She was Bell's student, and later, the love of his life. He was enchanted by her intelligence and her resilience. When he looked at the telephone, he did not see a tool for business. He saw a proxy for the ear. He saw a machine that could bridge the isolation that threatened the people he cherished. It is a profound irony that the man who gave the world the ability to speak across continents was driven by a love for those who could not hear the ringing of the bell. And yet, the complexities of Bell's mind were not without their shadows. His devotion to the deaf community was intense, but his philosophies were controversial. He feared the isolation of the deaf would lead to a separate variety of the human race, and he advocated for oralism, teaching the deaf to speak and read lips while discouraging the use of sign language. He believed he was liberating them from silence, forcing them into the world of the hearing, unaware that he was also suppressing a rich and vibrant culture of signs. His legacy in the deaf community remains a tapestry of gratitude and friction, a man who loved them deeply but sought to mold them in his own image of normalcy. Success brought Bell fame, but it did not bring him peace. In fact, he found his own invention to be a nuisance. He refused to keep a telephone in his study, regarding its ringing as an intruder that shattered his train of thought. He had unleashed a noise upon the world that he preferred to avoid. His mind, restless and incapable of stagnation, moved on to other elements: earth, water, and air. When President James A. Garfield was shot by an assassin in 1881, the bullet lodged deep within his body, eluding the probes of the surgeons. As the president lay dying, Bell, in a fever of patriotism and scientific desperation, invented an electromagnetic metal detector to locate the bullet without the intrusion of the knife. He worked tirelessly, testing the device on Civil War veterans who carried lead in their bodies. But when he brought it to the president's bedside, the device hummed erratically, confused and useless. Bell left in despair, unaware that the doctors had placed the president on a thoroughly modern innovation, a mattress with steel springs. The bed itself had blinded the machine. The bullet remained hidden, and the president died, leaving Bell haunted by the failure of science to outwit the crude reality of steel. As he grew older, his white beard billowing like a cloud, Bell turned his eyes upward. The man of the voice became a man of the wing. He founded the Aerial Experiment Association, obsessed with the problem of flight. He built massive kites made of tetrahedral cells, geometric honeycombs of red silk, that rose like alien structures over the green hills of his Nova Scotia estate, Ben Bray. He wanted to float, to catch the wind just as he had caught the voice. Under his guidance, the Silver Dart took to the skies, the first powered aircraft to fly in Canada. Fragile and trembling like a dragonfly against the cold winter air, even the water could not escape his inquiry. He dreamed of boats that could fly over the waves rather than ploughing through them. In his 70s, an age when most men retreat to the fireside, Bell was roaring across the Bras-d'Or Lake in the HD-4, a hydrofoil that lifted itself out of the water on ladder-like foils, achieving speeds of over 70 miles per hour. He was a grey-bearded daredevil, skimming the surface of the world, forever trying to move faster, to speak clearer, to bridge the gap between here and there. Throughout it all, the telephone network continued to grow, ignoring its creator's ambivalence. It spun its web across oceans and mountains, ignoring borders and time zones. Bell watched it from a distance, a father watching a child that has grown too large to control. He had started with a rubber skull in an attic, crying out for a mother, and he had ended with a world that could no longer stand to be silent. The copper wires hummed with the collective consciousness of the planet, a physical manifestation of the connections Bell had always sought. But as the 20th century marched forward, the wires began to feel heavy, tethered to the earth. The energy that Bell had unleashed, the undulating current, was restless. It remembered the open air. It remembered the days before the cable, when the only sound was the wind in the trees and the resonance of a voice carrying across a valley. The ground was conquered, stitched together by the tireless work of linemen and switchboard operators. But the sky above remained largely silent, a vast blue ocean of potential. The physics that Bell had championed, the conversion of sound into energy, was about to take another leap. The wires had taught the world to talk, but they were heavy, expensive, and fragile. They could snap in the wind. They could be cut by enemies. They ceased at the water's edge. Somewhere in the ether, in the invisible spectrum that Bell had brushed against with his photophone and his metal detectors, a new dream was forming. It was the dream of a voice without a wire, a signal that could drift like smoke, penetrating walls and crossing oceans without a physical thread to guide it. The harmonic dream was not over. It was merely shedding its skin as the sun set over the lakes of Nova Scotia, casting long shadows over the hydrofoils and the kites. The legacy of the vibration remained. The air itself was charged, waiting for the next hand to pluck it, waiting for the next frequency to be found. The silence of the funeral had passed, and the operators had plugged back in, but the static in the receiver whispered of something more. The undulating current was preparing to leave the wire and enter the void. To understand how the voice eventually left the wire to enter the void, one must travel back from the silence of the funeral and the wind-swept hills of Nova Scotia, following the thread of time backward to the damp cobblestone fog of Edinburgh, Scotland. Before there was a telephone, before there was a wire spanning a continent, there was simply a boy named Alec, living in a house built of sound. The air in the Bell household was not like the air in other homes. It was thick with resonance, curated and studied with the precision of a chemist measuring fluids. In this home, speech was not merely a tool for communication, it was a physical artifact, a tangible object to be dissected, polished and perfected. His grandfather, the first Alexander, was a titan of elocution, a man who could command a room with the mere arch of an eyebrow and the modulation of a vowel. He was the living embodiment of the proper tongue, the inspiration for literary figures who would seek to tame the wild dialects of the street. His father, Alexander Melville Bell, took this obsession further into the realm of science. He did not just teach men to speak, he mapped the geography of the human mouth. He invented visible speech, a cryptic and beautiful alphabet of symbols that did not represent sounds, but rather the positions of the throat, the tongue, and the lips. To the young Alec, these symbols were a secret code, a way to transcribe the invisible gymnastics of the breath. He learned that a circle meant a throat open wide, a curve meant the tongue rising to the roof of the mouth. The boy grew up watching his father sketch the architecture of silence turning into noise, but Alec felt small in the shadow of these giants. He was the third Alexander, a name that felt like a hand-me-down suit that didn't quite fit. He was possessed of a restless artistic spirit, a need to carve his own identity out of the heavy granite of his family's legacy. On his 11th birthday, in a quiet act of self-definition that foreshadowed the great inventions to come, he asked for a present that could not be wrapped. He asked for a name. He adopted the middle name Graham, honouring a family friend, and in doing so, he became Alexander Graham Bell. It was his first invention himself. This desire to construct, to build, soon moved from names to machinery. In the grey light of the Scottish afternoons, Alec and his brother Melville engaged in a project that teetered on the edge of the macabre, a project that showcased the strange, mechanical empathy that would define Bell's life. They decided to build a man, or, at least, the part of a man that mattered most to them, a voice. They secured a replica of a human skull, a hollow bone cage stripped of life. With meticulous patience of watchmakers, they began to reconstruct the soft tissues of speech using the materials of the industrial age. They fashioned a throat from gutta percha, a type of rigid rubber They stretched membranes to mimic vocal cords and built a bellows system to simulate the heaving of human lungs. It was a grotesque mimicry of biology, a Frankensteinian effort to capture the ghost of a voice in a machine of wood and rubber. When the device was finished, they carried it to the stairwell of their Edinburgh tenement. One brother worked the bellows, pumping air through the artificial trachea, while Alec manipulated the rubber lips and the tongue. As the air rushed through the tight vocal cords, a sound emerged. Not a beep, not a click, but a wail. They manipulated the lips, shaping the raw vibration until it formed a recognizable, terrifying word. Mama. The sound echoed through the stone hallway, so human and yet so lifeless that it reportedly sent neighbors into a panic, convinced a child was in distress. In that moment, holding the rubber throat of the automaton, Bell realized that the human voice was nothing more than physics. It was air and vibration, and if a skull of rubber could speak, then surely metal and electricity could be taught to do the same. But the drive to understand sound was not merely academic, it was rooted in a profound and quiet love. Alec's mother, Eliza, was slowly slipping into a world of silence. Her hearing faded year by year, turning the vibrant household into a place of muffled echoes for her. While others shouted to be heard, Alec discovered a different path. He would sit close to her, leaning in until his lips were touching her forehead. He would speak in a low, resonant baritone, allowing the vibrations of his voice to travel directly through the bone of her skull to her inner ear. He became her conduit to the world. He tapped out conversations on her palm, a tactile telegraphy of flesh on flesh. This intimacy with deafness, this physical connection to the mechanics of hearing, planted a seed deep in his mind. He saw that silence was a wall, but it was a wall that could be breached. He did not see the deaf as broken. He saw the problem as a failure of technology to bridge the gap. Yet this empathy was complicated. It was a tangled root system that would later grow into his controversial fears of a deaf race, a belief that would lead him to advocate against sign language, convinced that integration required the deaf to speak like the hearing. It was a shadow that would follow his legacy, a darkness born of a desperate, perhaps misguided, desire to normalize the world he loved. The shadows in Scotland, however, were turning deadly. The damp air that carried the sound of the church bells also carried the bacillus of tuberculosis. The White Plague swept through the Bell family with devastating speed. First, his younger brother Edward withered and died. Then, his older brother Melville succumbed to the coughing sickness. The house of sound was suddenly filled with the terrible silence of grief. Alec, too, began to grow thin, his face pale, the telltale cough rattling in his chest. His father, watching the last of his sons fading into the grey mist of Edinburgh, made a decision born of sheer terror. He would not let the grave claim the last Alexander. He packed up the family, abandoned his career, and fled across the ocean to the bracing clean air of Canada. They arrived in Brantford, Ontario in 1870. The transition was stark. They traded the claustrophobic stone streets for the open, rolling hills of the Grand River Valley. Here, the air was sharp and smelled of pine and earth. Alec, wrapped in blankets, spent his days outdoors, resting in a hammock strung between two birch trees on a bluff overlooking the river. He called it his dreaming place. As his lungs healed, filling with the new world's air, his mind began to race again. He lay there watching the river currents ripple and flow, thinking of the undulating waves. He thought of the telegraph wires that crisscrossed the expanding continent, carrying simple clicks and clacks, Morse code, a binary language of on and off. But Alec knew the world was not binary. The world was analog. It was a continuous wave, like the river below him. He began to dream of a harmonic telegraph, a device that could send multiple messages over a single wire by using different musical pitches, like a choir singing in harmony. He did not set out to invent the telephone. He set out to improve the telegraph. But the mistake is often the father of the miracle. Moving to Boston to teach the deaf, Bell set up a laboratory, a cluttered, wire-strewn attic where the smell of acid and ozone hung heavy in the air. He hired an assistant, Thomas Watson, a quick-handed machinist who could build whatever strange contraption Bell sketched in his notebooks. They spent their nights amidst tuning forks and magnetized reeds, plucking steel strips to see how they resonated. It was on a humid afternoon in June 1875 that the accident occurred. In the other room, Watson was plucking a reed that had become stuck to the magnet. He plucked it violently to free it. The twang echoed down the wire. In the other room, Bell, holding the receiver against his ear, heard not a click, but a distinct musical twang. It was the ghost of the reed. The current had not just signaled, it had copied the shape of the sound. The undulating current, the theory he had dreamed of on the riverbank, was real. The wire could carry tone, and if it could carry tone, it could carry the complex, shifting harmonics of the human voice. The race began. It was a feverish descent into the unknown. Bell worked until his eyes burned and his hands shook. He knew he was not alone in this pursuit. Elisha Gray, a formidable rival, was chasing the same phantom. The air was thick with the tension of discovery. On February 14, 1876, Bell's lawyers rushed to the patent office to file the application for improvements in telegraphy. 2 hours later, Elisha Gray's lawyers arrived. History, it seemed, turned on the axis of a single morning. But a patent is just paper. The machine still had to speak. March 10, 1876. The laboratory was cold. A vat of battery acid bubbled quietly on the workbench, the lifeblood of the new device. Bell stood over the transmitter, a crude assembly of wood, brass, and a liquid-filled cup. He was adjusting the needle, leaning in close, his focus absolute. His elbow knocked against the glass. The corrosive acid splashed onto his trousers, biting into the fabric and the skin beneath. It was a shock, a sudden, sharp pain in the quiet room. In his surprise, he didn't speak a grand soliloquy. He didn't quote Shakespeare or the Bible. He simply called out for help to the man in the other room, down the hall, beyond the reach of his natural voice. "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you." He spoke into the mouthpiece. The vibrations of his panic travelled through the needle, modulating the electrical resistance in the acid water. The current shimmered, copying the frantic wave of his voice. It raced through the copper wire, through the wall, into the receiver where Watson stood waiting. Watson pressed the device to his ear. The static hissed, a familiar companion, but then, cutting through the chaos, came the voice. It wasn't a buzz, it wasn't a code, it was Bell. The tone, the inflection, the urgency, it was all there. The voice had survived the journey through the metal. Watson dropped the receiver and ran into the room, his eyes wide, his breath catching. "I heard you," he shouted. "I heard the words." Bell forgot the burning acid on his leg. He looked at the device, then at Watson, and then at the wire that trailed off across the floor. The silence of the world. The silence that had taken his mother's hearing, the silence that had swallowed his brother's, had been broken. The skull in the Edinburgh attic had been rubber and air, a trick. This was no trick. This was a new anatomy. They had given the world a nervous system. The two men stood in the cluttered room, the fumes of the battery acid stinging their noses, realizing that the world had just shrunk. The distance between two minds had been reduced to the length of a copper strand. The first words had been spoken, not as a proclamation of glory, but as a mundane request for assistance, a plea for connection. As the adrenaline faded, Bell looked out the window at the Boston skyline. He could not yet know the lawsuits that were coming, the 600 legal battles that would try to strip him of this moment. He could not know that he would one day refuse to have this very machine in his own study, hating the intrusion of the ringing bell. He could not know of the global network, the billions of voices that would eventually crisscross the oceans. All he knew, in the quiet of that March evening, was that the vibration had held true. The wave had not broken. The voice had left his throat, travelled through the dark, cold heart of the copper, and arrived, intact, on the other side. The age of isolation was beginning to end, and the age of the network had begun. The wire was alive, and it was waiting for the next word. The success at the telephone brought fame, but the bell, the mind could not sit still on a single victory. The study of sound had been conquered, but the world was full of other invisible forces. As the telephone lines began to web across the cities like ivy, Bell's gaze lifted from the wire up to the sky, and then down to the water, where new challenges of resistance and flow awaited him. The man who had mastered the airwaves now felt the urge to master the air itself. But the mastery of the air would not come easily, for as the wires multiplied, so did the voices claiming ownership of the invisible. The quiet triumph of the laboratory was quickly replaced by the clamour of the courtroom, a dissonant chorus that would shadow Alexander Graham Bell for decades. The world had changed the moment his voice travelled down that wire, but the legal machinery of the 19th century ground slowly, fueled by ink and indignation. The patent he had filed on February 14, 1876, mere hours before his rival Elisha Gray filed a caveat for a similar device, became the most valuable document in history, and consequently the most contested. This was the beginning of the War of 600 Suits. It was a conflict not fought with soldiers, but with affidavits and technical diagrams. Over 600 lawsuits were launched against the Bell Telephone Company, a relentless siege of litigation that sought to prove Bell was not the sole father of the telephone. Rival inventors, opportunistic companies, and skeptics laid siege to his claim. They argued that he had stolen the idea, that his device was insufficient, or that the principles of telephony were public property. Through 18 long years of depositions, Bell was forced to explain over and over the precise moment of inspiration, the curvature of the membrane, and the undulation of the current. He never lost a single case. In the end, the Supreme Court upheld his priority, cementing his legacy not just as a scientist, but as a victor in the brutal arena of industrial law. Yet, to understand the man who stood so resolute in those courtrooms, one had to look back further than the invention itself, back to the misty streets of Edinburgh, Scotland, where the obsession with sound was not a commercial pursuit, but a family inheritance. He was born simply Alexander Bell, a boy surrounded by the mechanics of speech. His grandfather was a celebrated elocutionist, a man who could command a room with the precise modulation of a vowel. His father, Alexander Melville Bell, had gone even further, inventing visible speech, a complex system of symbols that mapped the physical geography of the mouth, the position of the tongue, the shape of the lips, the vibration of the throat, allowing anyone to pronounce any language perfectly, even if they had never heard it spoken. Young Alexander grew up in a house where breath was analyzed like a chemical compound. He was a boy seeking distinction in a lineage of formidable Alexanders, and so, on his 11th birthday, he adopted the middle name Graham, borrowing it from a family friend to carve out a small territory of his own identity. But his true territory was always the voice. As a teenager, fueled by his father's theories and a boyish curiosity for the macabre, he and his brother Melville undertook a project that would have terrified a less scientific household. They built a talking automaton. Using a replica of a human skull, they constructed a complex throat of rubber, a tongue of wood, and vocal cords that could vibrate with forced air. They connected a bellows to the base of the skull to simulate lungs. With Alexander manipulating the lips and his brother pumping the bellows, they forced the air through the rubber larynx until the skull let out a high, wailing cry, "Ma ma!" The sound was so lifelike, so disturbingly human, that neighbors in the tenement stairwell reportedly stopped in their tracks, searching for the distressed child. This mechanical man was more than a toy. It was the first manifestation of Bell's lifelong conviction that the human voice was merely a physical phenomenon, a puzzle of wind and resistance that could be replicated by wire and wood. However, the air in Edinburgh was not just carriers of sound, it was a carrier of death. The White Plague, tuberculosis, stalked the Bell family with tragic persistence. It claimed his younger brother Edward, and then his older brother Melville. When Alexander himself began to show the pale, exhausted signs of the disease, his father, terrified of losing his last surviving son, uprooted the family, They fled the damp, coal-choked air of Scotland for the crisp, restorative winds of Brantford, Ontario. It was a migration born of desperation, a flight for life that landed them in a place where Bell could recover his strength, in a dreaming place overlooking the Grand River. It was here, in the quiet of the Canadian countryside, that the telephone began to take shape, though not by design. Bell had been attempting to create a harmonic telegraph, a device intended to send multiple telegraph messages simultaneously over a single wire by using different musical pitches. He was thinking in terms of musical notes, of dots and dashes singing in harmony. But in his failure to perfect the telegraph, he stumbled upon the principle of the telephone. He realized that if a current could vary in intensity precisely as the air varies in density during the production of sound, he could transmit the complex architecture of the human voice. The telephone was, in essence, a beautiful mistake, a deviation from the intended path that led to a new world. Yet beneath the mechanics and the wires, Bell's deepest psychological tether was not to the hearing world, but to the world of silence. His mother, Eliza, was nearly deaf, relying on a cumbersome ear tube to catch fragments of conversation. Bell would often press his lips to her forehead, speaking in a low, resonant resonance that she could feel through her skull bones. This tactile communication forged a profound empathy in him, a drive to bridge the gap of isolation. This connection deepened when he met Mabel Hubbard, a brilliant young woman who had lost her hearing to scarlet fever at the age of 5. She became his student, then his muse, and finally his wife. Mabel was the anchor of his life, the calm center around which his chaotic intellect spun. But Bell's relationship with the deaf community was complex and fraught with a darker philosophy. While he loved Mabel and devoted his life to teaching the deaf, he harbored a fear of what he called a death variety of the human race. He worried that if deaf people married one another, their deafness would propagate, creating a closed society cut off from the hearing majority. This belief led him to advocate for oralism, the suppression of sign language in favor of lip reading and speech. He believed he was liberating the deaf from isolation, but in doing so, he sought to erase their native language, a stance that would leave a controversial scar on his legacy within deaf culture. To Bell, communication was the ultimate goal, but it had to be communication on the terms of the majority, a bridging of worlds that required the silent to speak. This duality defined him. The man who gave the world a telephone often refused to have one in his own study. He viewed the ringing bell as an intrusion, a tyrant that demanded immediate attention and shattered his train of thought. He was an inventor who craved silence to think, yet spent his life filling the silence of others. His restless mind could not remain fixed on the telephone. As the years passed and his wealth grew, Bell transformed from a struggling teacher into a grand patriarch of science, his beard whitening, his figure growing imposing. He turned his attention to saving lives in other ways. In the sweltering summer of 1881, when President James A. Garfield lay dying from an assassin's bullet, Bell was summoned to the White House. The doctors could not locate the lead slug lodged in the president's back, and probing for it was causing infection. Bell, working in a feverish haze of patriotism and scientific urgency, developed an electromagnetic metal detector. He brought the device to the president's bedside, a humming coil designed to sing out when it crossed over metal. But when he swept it over Garfield's body, the device began to hum erratically, confused and indistinct. Desperate, Bell returned to his lab, recalibrating, not knowing that the interference came not from his machine, but from the bed itself. The president was lying on one of the newly invented coil spring mattresses, a hidden grid of steel that blinded the detector. The bullet remained found only by the autopsy, and Bell was left with the heavy weight of a failure that was not truly his own. He found solace in his friendship with Helen Keller, a bond that spanned decades. It was Bell who at first directed her father to the Perkins Institution, setting in motion the arrival of Anne Sullivan. To Helen, Bell was not a distant genius, but a tender friend who learned to use a Braille typewriter to correspond with her. He remained her champion, a man who understood that the mind could soar even when the senses were shuttered. In his later years, at his estate Binbray in Nova Scotia, Bell's gaze turned finally to the physical elements. He became obsessed with the problems of flight and resistance. He reasoned that if he could send a voice through a wire, he could send a man through the clouds. He founded the Aerial Experiment Association, mentoring young engineers and overseeing the construction of the Silver Dart, a delicate dragonfly of wood and fabric that achieved the first powered flight in the British Empire. He did not stop at the air. He looked to the water, frustrated by the drag of hulls against the sea. He developed the HD-4, a hydrofoil craft that looked like a skeletal insect skimming the surface. In 1919, roaring across the Brasdor Lake, it set a world marine speed record of over 70 miles per hour, the white spray fanning out behind it like the wings of a great bird. He was an old man then, speeding across the water, his mind still racing ahead of the present. He had started with the anatomy of the ear and ended with the aerodynamics of speed. But the copper web he had spun in his youth had grown to encompass the planet. It had changed the way human beings loved, fought, negotiated, and grieved. It had shrunk the world. When Alexander Graham Bell finally succumbed to the complications of diabetes in August of 1922, the world prepared a tribute fitting for the man who had conquered distance. He was buried on a hilltop in Nova Scotia, under the wide, open sky he had sought to master. But the true memorial took place 2 days later, during his funeral service. Orders were sent out across the vast, trembling network of the Bell system, in telephone exchanges from New York to San Francisco. From the bustle of Chicago to the quiet rural outposts of the Canadian plains, the operators watched the clock. At the designated moment a signal was given. The hands pulled back from the switchboards. The plugs remained in their cradles. For 1 full minute, the entire telephone network of North America was silenced. 13 million telephones ceased to ring. The hum of conversation that had become the background noise of the 20th century was extinguished. The wires stretching for millions of miles across mountains and under rivers went dead. It was a global breath held in reverence. The man who had broken the silence of the world was honored by the return of that silence. A brief, deafening pause in the chatter of humanity before the plugs were pushed back in. The connections were re-established, and the great electric conversation resumed its endless flow. The silence passed, but the current remained. The world had been wired, and the mind of the inventor had dissolved into the network he created, present in every ring, in every voice traveling through the dark, waiting to be heard. The age of the solitary genius was fading, making way for the age of the system, where the legacy of the man was no longer flesh and bone, but the pulse of the signal itself. This pulse, this electric heartbeat, did not stop at the shores of the Atlantic. It gathered strength, waiting for the next leap, for the minds that would take Bell's copper threads and weave them into something even more pervasive. The story of connection was far from over. It was merely changing its medium. The airwaves themselves were beginning to vibrate with a new kind of energy, a frequency that would require no wires at all. But to understand the pulse that would eventually encircle the globe, one must look back before the wires were strung, back to a city of grey stone and damp fog, where the obsession with sound was not merely a trade but a bloodline. Long before the airwaves began to vibrate with wireless energy, they were being studied in the quiet, gaslit rooms of Edinburgh, Scotland, by a boy who felt the weight of his own name. Born simply Alexander Bell, he was a child of restless intellect, growing up in a house where the air was thick with the study of elocution. His grandfather was a master of speech, a man who could command a room with the mere modulation of a vowel, and his father, Alexander Melville Bell, was a pioneer in the architecture of the human voice. The boy, however, felt the shadow of these two Alexanders stretching long over his own identity. He was the third in a line of sonic architects, and on his 11th birthday, in a quiet act of self-definition, he adopted the middle name Graham, borrowing it from a family friend, hoping to carve out a frequency of his own amidst the resonance of his ancestors. The Bell household was a laboratory of linguistics. His father had developed a system known as visible speech, a code of symbols that did not represent letters, but rather the physical positioning of the throat, the tongue, and the lips. To the uninitiated, they were strange, cryptic runes, but to the bells, they were the mechanical blueprints of human connection. The father would send his sons out of the room, waiting while a visitor uttered a phrase in a language the boys did not know. Sanskrit, Gaelic, or Hindi. When summoned back, young Alexander Graham would study the symbols his father had transcribed, positioning his mouth exactly as the ink dictated, and miraculously, the foreign words would tumble from his lips, precise and intelligible, without him understanding a syllable of what he had said. It was here, in the parlour of his youth, that the seed was planted, the realization that sound was not a mystical spirit, but a physical phenomenon, a mechanical operation of wind and muscle that could be analyzed, deconstructed, and perhaps reconstructed. This mechanical curiosity took a turn toward the uncanny in his teenage years. Driven by a desire to understand the very machinery of life, Alexander and his brother Melville retreated to the attic to build a being of their own. It was a project of Gothic ambition. They acquired a replica of a human skull and set about replicating the soft tissues of the throat using rubber and cotton. They constructed a windpipe, vocal cords stretched tight, and a pair of bellows to serve as lungs. It was a painstaking assembly of wood, rubber, and bone, a silent effigy waiting for breath. When the bellows were pumped and the air forced through the synthetic glottis, the brothers manipulated the rubber lips, moulding the escaping hiss into shape. A sound, low and mournful, began to resonate from the skull. With careful adjustments, the machine groaned a recognizable, terrified word, "Mama." It was a triumph of acoustics, so convincing that neighbors were said to have paused in the street, unsettled by the disembodied cry of a child emanating from the Bell attic. This was the young inventor's first telephone, not a wire carrying electricity, but a skull breathing rubber, a testament to his lifelong compulsion to make the inanimate speak. But the air of Edinburgh, for all its intellectual richness, was heavy with a more sombre reality. The fog that rolled off the North Sea carried with it the spectre of tuberculosis, the white plague that haunted the tenements and townhouses alike. The Bell family, masters of breath and voice, found themselves under siege by a disease that stole both. First, Alexander's younger brother Edward faded into silence, his lungs failing him. Then, his older brother, Melville, the partner in his attic experiments, was taken by the same cruel wasting. Alexander himself, the last surviving son, began to show the telltale signs, the fatigue, the pallor, the shadow in the chest. Desperate to save the final thread of his lineage, Alexander's father uprooted the family. They fled the damp stone of Scotland for the crisp open air of Brantford, Ontario. It was a migration born of grief, a flight to the new world, not for fortune, but for breath itself. There, on a bluff overlooking the Grand River, the young Alexander Graham Bell lay on a rug in the grass, breathing in the Canadian summer, feeling the strength return to his frame. It was in this dreaming place, as he called it, that the grief of the past began to transmute into the vision of the future. The telephone was not his intended destination. It was a deviation, a beautiful mistake, born from the pursuit of the harmonic telegraph. Bell had been trying to solve the problem of congestion on telegraph lines, hypothesizing that multiple messages could be sent simultaneously if they were transmitted at different pitches, like the chords of a piano traveling down a single string. But in listening to the plucking of reeds and the humming of magnets, his ear, trained by 2 generations of elocutionists, caught something others had missed. He realized that an electrical current could be made to undulate, to rise and fall in complex waves that mirrored the density of air during speech. On that fateful day in Boston, when the acid spilled, and he called out to his assistant Watson, the mechanism was simple, but the implication was profound. He had not just sent a signal, he had sent a piece of himself. The voice, once tethered to the range of the lungs, was now unmoored, capable of travelling through copper veins to the other side of the wall, and eventually the other side of the world. Yet, behind the mechanics of the telephone lay a deeper, more personal silence. Bell's life was inextricably bound to the quiet world of the deaf. His mother, Eliza, had lost her hearing, forcing Bell to speak to her by tapping against her forehead or shouting into the sounding board of a piano so she could feel the vibrations. Later, his heart would be captured by Mabel Hubbard, a brilliant young woman who had lost her hearing to scarlet fever at the age of 5. Mabel was his anchor and his muse. It was her father, a wealthy lawyer who financed Bell's experiments, but it was Mabel's silence that drove his philosophy. Bell did not view himself primarily as an inventor, but as a teacher of the deaf. And yet, this devotion carried a complex, controversial shadow. Bell believed fervently in the power of speech, so much so that he viewed sign language as a prison, a forbidden language that isolated the deaf from the rest of humanity. He feared the formation of a closed society, a deaf race cut off from the mainstream. In his zeal to integrate the deaf into the hearing world, he became a champion of oralism, advocating for the suppression of signing in favor of lip reading and vocal training. It was a stance born of love, but steeped in a tragic irony. The man who gave the world the ability to speak across continents spent decades trying to silence the natural language of the community he claimed to serve. He wanted to cure the isolation of the deaf, yet in doing so, he sought to strip them of their own culture, a paradox that would complicate his legacy for generations. This duality, the desire to connect and the urge to control, rippled through his life. He was a man of immense empathy who cautioned Helen Keller's father to seek the Perkins Institution, setting in motion the relationship between Keller and Anne Sullivan. Keller would later dedicate her autobiography to Bell, describing him as the door through which she stepped from darkness into light. He even learned to type in Braille to communicate with her directly, his fingers tapping out the patterns of connection that his voice could not carry to her. And yet, the very machine that made him famous, the telephone, became a source of irritation to him. As the network spread, webbing the cities and entering the homes of millions, Bell found the constant ringing to be an intrusion on his thoughts. He refused to have a telephone in his private study, viewing it as a leash that tethered him to the trivialities of the world when he wished to let his mind soar. And soar it did. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the grey-bearded patriarch turned his eyes from the wires to the sky. At his estate in Nova Scotia, Edinburgh, he became obsessed with the mechanics of flight. He filled the air with massive tetrahedral kites, geometric hives of red silk and wood that hovered like alien craft over the Bras-d'Or lake. He gathered a group of brilliant young engineers, the Aerial Experiment Association, and guided them in the construction of the Silver Dart, a delicate dragonfly of a machine that achieved the first powered flight in Canada. When the air had been conquered, he turned his gaze downward to the water. Bell, now an old man with a mane of white hair, became fascinated by the idea of lifting boats out of the friction of the waves. He developed hydrofoils, vessels that stood on underwater wings. In 1919, his Hajj D4 roared across the lake at over 70 miles per hour, a blur of speed and spray, skipping over the surface of the water, just as his voice had learned to skip over the surface of the earth. But even the fastest vessel must eventually come to rest. The boy who had built a talking skull, the young man who had listened to the singing of the wires, and the old sage who had tried to teach the world to fly, finally succumbed to the silence he had spent his life fighting. In August of 1922, at his beloved estate in Nova Scotia, Alexander Graham Bell closed his eyes. The tribute that followed was unlike any the world had ever seen. It was not a cannon blast or a choral hymn. It was a global cessation of the very thing he had created. For 1 minute, during his funeral, the order went out to every exchange in North America. Operators pulled their plugs, connections were severed. The humming hives of the telephone network, now growing into a massive nervous system across the continent, went dead. 13 million telephones fell silent. The great conversation that had begun in a Boston attic paused, and for 60 seconds the world remembered the quiet from which the voice had emerged. The silence did not last, of course. The plugs were pushed back in, the current resumed, and the human voice continued its ceaseless journey through the wires. But the pause marked a transition. The era of the lone inventor, tinkering with reeds and magnets, was ending. The principles Bell had uncovered, The conversion of sound to energy, the transmission of waves, were already escaping the confines of the copper wire. The atmosphere itself was becoming a conductor. Even as Bell lay in his grave, a new generation of listeners was tuning in to the static of the skies. They were discovering that the air was not empty, but thick with invisible rivers of information. The bidden language of the ether was waiting to be decoded. The wireless age was dawning, and the signals were no longer tethered to the earth, but were beginning to bounce off the ionosphere, arcing over oceans without the need for a physical bridge. The mind of the machine was expanding, preparing to speak not just to a neighbor, but to the stars. And yet, before the mind of the machine could fully escape to the stars, the man who birthed it was pulled violently back to the heaviness of the earth. The ethereal promise of the wireless future was a dream for another century. Alexander Graham Bell lived in the tangible, often painful present, where the limitations of the human body were far more stubborn than the limitations of copper wire. It was the summer of 1881, and the United States was holding its breath. The heat in Washington, D.C. was oppressive, a thick, humid blanket that settled over the Capitol, carrying with it the heavy silence of a nation in waiting. President James A. Garfield lay in a sickbed within the White House, a bullet lodged somewhere deep within his torso. An assassin's slug had struck him, but the surgeons, with their probing fingers and unwashed instruments, could not locate the metal shard. The medical science of the day was failing. They were blind, groping in the dark of the president's flesh, searching for a piece of lead no larger than a fingertip. The world watched as the leader of the country faded, infection and uncertainty taking their slow toll. In his laboratory in Boston, Bell felt the vibrations of this tragedy not as a political crisis, but as a challenge of acoustics and physics. He was 34 years old, already famous, already greying, his mind a ceaseless engine that could not idle. The telephone was behind him, a settled matter of commerce and lawsuits, but the problem of the president's bullet reignited the spark of the humanitarian scientist within him. He believed that science should alleviate suffering. If sound could be made to travel through wire, surely a hidden piece of metal could be made to sing its location. He did not sleep. The humidity of the summer clung to him as he worked feverishly, surrounded by coils of wire, batteries, and the chaotic detritus of invention. He was attempting to repurpose the principles of the telephone into something new, an induction balance. The concept was elegant in its theoretical purity. He would create an electromagnetic field using two coils. If the field remained undisturbed, the device would remain silent, a perfect zero. But if a metallic object, like a lead bullet, entered that invisible field, it would disrupt the balance. The induction would break, and a faint, spectral tone would become audible in the telephone receiver pressed to the operator's ear. It was a search for resonance in the void. Bell worked until his eyes burned and his hands shook. He tested the device on Civil War veterans who still carried bullets in their bodies, the whom of the machine confirming the metal beneath their scars. It worked. The invisible could be made audible. With a heart heavy with hope, Bell boarded a train for Washington, the induction balance carefully crated like a fragile instrument of salvation. The atmosphere inside the White House was stifling. The curtains were drawn against the relentless sun, creating a perpetual twilight in the sick room. The air smelled of antiseptic and stale heat. When Bell entered, he was not the titan of industry, but a quiet technician, humble before the gravity of life and death. He asked for silence. The device was sensitive, reliant on the faintest whisper of a tone, a sound so delicate it sat on the very edge of human perception. He moved the wand over the president's body. He listened. He waited for the hum. But the machine lied. It sang, but it sang everywhere. A chaotic, sputtering static filled the receiver, a drone of interference that made no sense. Bell adjusted the coils. He checked the batteries. He wiped the sweat from his brow, feeling the heavy gaze of the desperate doctors upon him. He tried again. The signal was muddied, a confused chorus of metal that seemed to suggest the president's body was filled with bullets, or that the bullet was moving, or that physics itself was bending in the heat of the room. Bell left the White House defeated, carrying the weight of a nation's disappointment. He returned to the lab, recalibrating, obsessing, trying to understand the failure of the perfect theory. It was only later, after Garfield had succumbed to infection, not from the bullet, but from the probing of the doctors, that the tragic truth of the interference was revealed. It was a failure of context, not science. The president had been lying on a new modern innovation, a mattress fitted with coil springs. The metal springs, hidden beneath the horsehair and linen, had formed a massive field of interference. Bell's machine had been detecting the bed itself, singing out in response to the steel coils that cradled the dying man. The technology of comfort had obscured the technology of salvation. It was a cruel irony that Bell, a man who had spent his life trying to make the invisible visible, had been thwarted by the unseen metal beneath the sheets. This failure haunted him, but it also underscored the deep psychological tether that bound him to his work. Bell was never merely an engineer of gadgets. He was a man obsessed with bridging the gaps between isolated worlds. His motivation was personal, rooted in the silence of the women he loved. His mother, Eliza, had been nearly deaf, pressing an ear trumpet to the piano to feel the vibrations of the music. His wife, Mabel, had lost her hearing to scarlet fever at the age of 5. Bell did not see the telephone as a tool for business, but as a prosthetic for the human connection. He lived in a house where silence was not empty, but heavy with meaning. He saw the isolation that deafness could bring in the 19th century, the way it cut a soul off from the current of human experience. This empathy was the engine of his life, far more powerful than any battery he ever wired. It was why, years after the telephone had made him wealthy, he described his occupation not as inventor, but simply as teacher of the deaf. This devotion led him to a farmhouse in Alabama and to a young wild girl named Helen Keller. Before the world knew her name, before Anne Sullivan had broken through the dark walls of her isolation, it was Alexander Graham Bell who held Helen on his knee. He felt her small hand vibrating against his vest as his pocket watch ticked. He was the one who told her father to seek out the Perkins Institution, setting in motion one of the great miracles of communication in history. Bell and Keller remained tethered to one another for the rest of his life. He learned to operate a Braille typewriter to send her letters, his fingers punching out the raised dots with the same precision he used to wind electromagnetic coils. She, in turn, dedicated her autobiography to him, calling him the door through which she had walked into the world. To Bell, the human voice was precious because he knew intimately the pain of its absence. And yet, a profound paradox lay at the heart of his existence. The man who had given the world the ability to speak across continents grew to despise the very instrument he had created. As the telephone network spread like a nervous system across the globe, ringing in parlours and offices, interrupting dinners and thoughts, Bell found it to be a torment. He refused to have a telephone in his own study. He viewed the ringing bell not as a triumph, but as an intrusion. It was a demand for attention, a shattering of the solitary concentration he needed to think. He had destroyed distance, but in doing so, he had also destroyed privacy. The intrusion he spoke of was the relentless connectivity of the modern world, a web he had spun but now wished to escape. He craved the silence he had spent his life trying to cure in others. In his later years, seeking that silence and a new frontier, Bell turned his eyes away from the wires and toward the elements, the water and the air. The grey-bearded patriarch, now living on his sprawling estate of Ben Bray in Nova Scotia, became obsessed with the problems of flight and hydrodynamics. If the earth was too crowded with voices, perhaps the sky offered a new quietude. He surrounded himself with young engineers, founding the Aerial Experiment Association. He was no longer the young man shivering in a Boston boarding house. He was a mentor, a sage, guiding the hands that built the silver dart when the fragile craft took to the air over the frozen Brasdor Lake, lifting off the ice under its own power. Bell watched with the wonder of a child. He was witnessing the birth of another age, seeing humanity sever the gravitational chains just as he had severed the acoustic ones. But the air was not enough. He looked to the water. He dreamed of boats that could fly, vessels that could lift their hulls out of the dragging friction of the sea. He built the HD-4, a hydrofoil that looked like a skeletal insect skimming the waves. It roared across the lake at over 70 miles per hour, a blur of spray and speed, setting world records that would stand for decades. In the roar of the engine and the rush of the wind, Bell found a different kind of frequency, a visceral, physical vibration that didn't carry words, only pure momentum. These later inventions were the playthings of a mind that refused to settle. But they were also escapes. They were attempts to outrun the legacy of the telephone, to find a new magic that didn't involve the endless chatter of commerce. He worried, deeply and controversially, about the future of the human race. His mind, always categorizing and analyzing, drifted into darker territories of eugenics and the fear of a death variety of the human race. He advocated for oralism, the teaching of speech over sign language, believing that sign language isolated the deaf in a closed loop. It was a stance born of a desire to integrate, but it inflicted a deep cultural wound that would take generations to heal. He was a complex tapestry of benevolence and stubbornness, a man who loved his deaf wife with a fierce, protective passion, yet campaigned against the very language that many deaf people held dear. He was a savior to Helen Keller and a failed savior to President Garfield. He was the father of the telephone, who would stuff towels around the ringer to stifle its cry. As the years deepened and his white beard grew fuller, giving him the appearance of an Old Testament prophet, Bell spent more time looking out over the misty waters of Nova Scotia. The world had changed irrevocably because of him. The planet was now wrapped in a skein of copper, a humming ball of conversation that never slept. Cities were noisy, electric, connected. The isolation of the 19th century had been shattered. But on his private point of land, Bell sought the rhythms of the natural world. He watched the eagles circle the thermal currents, noting the angle of their wings. He watched the tetrahedrons of his kites bite into the wind, stable and strong. He was preparing for a final transition, a departure from the realm of vibrations and currents. When the end finally came, in August of 1922, it was not marked by the roar of a hydrofoil or the static of a radio. It was marked by a profound and deliberate silence. Bell passed away at his estate, his hand in Mabel's, the silence between them final and absolute. News of his death travelled instantly through the very wires he had strung across the continent. It raced from Nova Scotia to New York to Chicago to San Francisco, moving at the speed of lightning. And then a tribute was organized that demonstrated the sheer magnitude of his impact, a tribute that would have been impossible before he lived. Orders were sent down the lines, switches were thrown. For 1 full minute during the funeral service, the entire telephone network of North America was commanded to cease. 13 million telephones fell silent. The operators pulled their plugs. The busy signals stopped. The chatter of business, the gossip of neighbours, the orders of merchants, the whispers of lovers, all of it was severed. The great hum of the 20th century was extinguished, creating a void of silence that stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It was a silence deeper than any Bell had known in his life, a momentary return to the quiet world he had been born into. In that minute of artificial stillness, the world realized just how loud it had become, and how thoroughly one man's mind had rewired the experience of being human. The silence held for 60 seconds, and then, as the minute hand ticked forward, the plugs were pushed back in. The current resumed. The hum returned, louder than before, carrying on its ceaseless journey into a future where the wires would eventually dissolve entirely, leaving only the invisible architecture of the air. The man was gone, but the signal remained, expanding outward, waiting for the next great leap. The copper threads that bound the continents were merely the nervous system for a body that was still growing, evolving toward a consciousness that would eventually encircle the globe in a web of light. And in that returning roar of connection, the story of the lone inventor faded, replaced by the complex, interconnected reality. He had engineered a reality where no voice would ever truly be lost in the dark again, and where the echoes of the past would vibrate endlessly into the awaiting future. While the world was busy wiring itself together, listening to the hum of the new electric age, the man who had sparked that revolution found himself retreating from the very noise he had created. It is a strange irony of history that Alexander Graham Bell, the architect of global connection, eventually came to view the telephone not as a beloved child, but as an intrusion. By the time his hair had turned a distinctive snowy white, and his beard had grown full and majestic, he had banished the device from his private study. He famously called it a pest, a demand on his attention that he refused to grant. The world wanted him to be a businessman, a titan of industry managing patents and lawsuits, but his soul remained that of a restless experimenter, a teacher of the deaf, and a dreamer who looked not just across the wires, but up toward the sky and down into the deep blue water. To understand the true scope of his mind, one must leave the bustling exchanges of Boston and Washington and travel north to the cool, mist-shrouded embrace of Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia. Here, on a sprawling estate he named Bayan Baraha, Galit, for beautiful mountain, Bell constructed a sanctuary for his imagination. The air here was different. It smelled of pine resin and salt spray, far removed from the stale courtrooms where lawyers argued over who had invented the transmission of speech. Here the only voices were those of his family, and the wind rushing over the Brasdor Lake. It was in this northern refuge that the inventor's mind, freed from the tether of the telephone, began to expand in directions that seemed, to the outside observer, almost fantastical. He was not merely a man of sound. He was a man of vibration, of lift, and of speed. He had conquered the distance between voices, and now he sought to conquer the friction of the earth itself. But before he could fully give himself over to the wind and the waves, there were moments where the weight of his reputation pulled him back into the grim realities of human fragility. One such moment arrived in the sweltering summer of 1881, a chapter of his life often overshadowed by his other triumphs, yet one that reveals the desperate, empathetic beat of his heart. President James A. Garfield had been shot. The bullet from the assassin's gun was lodged somewhere in the president's back, eluding the probing instruments of the finest surgeons in the country. The nation held its breath as infection set in, the summer heat turning the president's sick room into a stifling oven. Bell, watching from a distance, felt a compulsion to help. He believed that science could see what the human eye could not. He dropped his other work and began to frantically develop a device he called the induction balance, an early rudimentary form of the metal detector. The scene of this endeavor was one of high tension and exhausted determination. Bell worked through sleepless nights, tweaking coils and batteries, listening for the faint telltale hum that would indicate the presence of lead. When he was finally summoned to the White House, the atmosphere was heavy with impending grief. Bell, the great communicator, stood over the fading president, passing his wand over the feverish body, listening with the intense focus of a musician tuning a rare instrument. He heard a sound. The device hummed, but it hummed everywhere. It was a confused, static signal that offered no clear map for the surgeons. Desperate and baffled, Bell returned to his lab, recalibrated and tried again, but the result was the same tragic ambiguity. It was only later, after Garfield had succumbed to infection and passed into history, that the cruel variable was revealed. The president had been lying on a thoroughly modern innovation, a mattress supported by coiled metal springs. The hidden steel beneath the sheets had confused the magnetic field of Bell's device, masking the bullet in a sea of interference. It was a failure that haunted Bell, a reminder that even the most brilliant mind is sometimes thwarted by the invisible variables of the world. Yet sorrow never kept him stagnant for long. Back at Ben Bray, the grief of the world was washed away by the sheer scale of his curiosity. His home became a gathering place not just for scientists, but for those who lived in the silence he understood so well. The most poignant of these visitors was Helen Keller. The relationship between the aging inventor and the young woman who could neither hear nor see was one of profound, tactile beauty. Bell had been the first to suggest to Helen's father that she could be taught, setting her on the path to meeting Anne Sullivan. Now, years later, they sat together on the porch overlooking the water. To communicate, Bell did not need his wires or his batteries. He would tap into her palm, his large, callous fingers spelling out the majestic view before them, the way the light hit the water, the rustle of the leaves, the passing of a cloud. He learned to use a Braille typewriter specifically to write to her, bridging their isolation with the same fervour he had once applied to the telephone. Helen later wrote that Bell had a dominating personality, but it was a dominance born of love and a refusal to accept limitations. In her silent world, he was a vibration of pure energy, a man who treated her not as a broken thing to be fixed, but as a brilliant mind to be engaged. It was a grounding connection for him, a reminder that communication was, at its core, an act of intimacy, not technology. Fueled by this human connection, his scientific gaze turned upward. The dream of flight had seized him. In the early years of the 20th century, while the Wright brothers were secretly gliding over the dunes of Kitty Hawk, Bell was conducting highly public, geometrical experiments on the frozen lakes of Nova Scotia. He was obsessed with stability. He did not want to merely fly. He wanted to float with the security of a structure that could not fail. He began to build kites, but these were not the toys of children. They were massive, cellular structures formed from thousands of tetrahedrons, pyramid shapes covered in red silk. They looked like alien architecture, vast honeycombs of crimson fabric rising into the grey winter sky. Bell would stand on the ice, his white beard blowing in the gale, watching as these massive structures, carrying the weight of a man, lifted gracefully into the air. He called one of them the Cygnet, the Swan. When it rose, it was a marriage of engineering and art, a heavy, impossible thing made light by the perfect application of physics. This obsession culminated in the Aerial Experiment Association, a group of young, brilliant engineers Bell gathered around him, including Glenn Curtiss. Under Bell's mentorship, they moved from kites to engines. On a crisp day in February 1909, the Silver Dart was rolled out onto the ice of Badeck Bay. It was a fragile skeleton of wood, wire, and fabric, powered by a roaring V8 engine. As the propeller spun, kicking up a mist of ice crystals, the machine accelerated. And then it happened. The Silver Dart left the surface of the Earth. It flew for half a mile, hovering over the frozen white expanse, marking the first powered flight in Canada and the British Empire. Bell, watching from his sleigh, saw the realization of a dream that went back to his childhood, the ability to detach from the ground, to become a creature of the air. He had given the world a voice. Now he was helping to give it wings. But the air was not enough. The water of the Bras-d'Or Lake teased him with another problem: drag. Bell watched boats ploughing through the water, wasting energy as they pushed the liquid aside. He wondered, with the simplicity of genius, why a boat should not fly through the water rather than float on it. And so the Hydrodrome was born. The HD-4, it was a beast of a machine, looking less like a boat and more like a cigar-shaped torpedo fitted with ladder-like foils on either side. The concept was radical. As the boat gained speed, the water pressure on the foils would lift the hull entirely out of the water, reducing drag to almost nothing. The boat would essentially fly on submerged wings. In 1919, when Bell was 72 years old, an age when most men settle into the quiet atrophy of retirement, he was strapping himself into this roaring monster. The HD-4 was fitted with two massive Liberty aircraft engines, surplus from the Great War. When the throttles were pushed forward, the noise was cataclysmic, a thunderclap that echoed off the hills of Ben Bray. Witnesses described the sight as terrifying and majestic. The boat would start with a heavy lurch, ploughing through the waves. Then, as the speed mounted, the nose would rise. The hull would break free from the surface tension, lifting higher and higher until the entire vessel was skimming on nothing but the thin steel blades of the hydrofoils. It looked like a giant water spider sprinting across the surface. On its record-breaking run, the HD-4 reached a speed of 70.86 miles per hour. It was a velocity that seemed impossible on water at the time. Bell, the man who had spent his youth studying the delicate vibrations of the human throat, was now the master of raw kinetic power. He had rewired the world, he had sent men into the sky, and now he had made steel walk on water. Yet, despite the roar of the engines and the rush of the wind, the core of Alexander Graham Bell remained tethered to the quiet mysteries of existence. He spent his final years at Bean Bray, not as a celebrity, but as a philosopher of the natural world. He would spend hours floating in a small boat, staring down into the depths, or sitting in his study still, without a telephone, pondering the nature of heredity, the future of the death, and the vast, interconnecting web of life. He had come to realize that invention was not about creating machinery, but about understanding the hidden laws of the universe and bending them slightly to human will. The copper wires he had strung across the continents were just one frequency in a spectrum that included the lift of a wing, the buoyancy of a hull, and the silent, pressing touch of a hand on a loved one's palm. As the summer of 1922 approached, the inventor's own energy began to wane. The diabetes that had plagued him for years began to claim its toll. The man who had been a force of nature, constantly moving, constantly questioning, found himself growing still. His mind, however, remained lucid, a bright, burning light in a failing vessel. He had lived a life of constant output, of projecting his voice and his ideas outward into the world. Now, the tide was turning inward. The wings and water he had conquered were waiting to reclaim him. He had spent a lifetime fighting against the limits of the human condition, fighting against silence, against distance, against gravity, against friction. He had won so many of those battles, leaving behind a world that was faster, louder, and smaller than the one he had been born into. But even for a man who could send a voice across a continent, or lift a machine into the clouds, there remained one final frontier, one last great silence that could not be bridged by wire or wing. The sun was setting over the Brasdeau Lake, casting long, shimmering reflections of gold and violet across the water where his hydrofoils had once raced. The wind died down, leaving the air still and heavy with the scent of pine. The machinery of his life was quieting down, preparing for the moment when the current would finally be cut and the great transmitter would send its final signal into the dark. The stage was set for the last act, a moment not of invention, but of profound collective remembrance. The world he had connected was about to pause, to take a breath, and to listen to the silence he was about to leave behind. It was a silence that felt entirely different from the one he had fought against his entire life. For 75 years, Alexander Graham Bell had waged a relentless war on isolation, driven by a deep personal tether to the world of the soundless. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and fading oranges, his mind drifted between the waking world and the velvet softness of memory. He floated back to the grey cobblestone streets of Edinburgh, seeing himself as a boy of 11, frustrated by the weight of a name shared with his father and grandfather. He remembered the day he gifted himself the middle name Graham, wearing it like a badge of individuality, determined to carve a path that was his alone. He remembered the strange, macabre experiments of his youth in that tall Scottish house, specifically the talking automaton he had built with his brother. It was a grotesque assembly of a replica human skull, vocal cords fashioned from rubber, and a bellows to force air through the artificial throat. They had manipulated the lips and pumped the air until the machine cried out a terrifying, mechanical mama, a sound so human yet so hollow that it sent neighbors into a panic. That boy had been obsessed with the mechanics of speech, born into a lineage of elocutionists who believed the tongue and lips were instruments to be mastered, instruments that could unlock the prison of silence. But it was love and fear that had truly propelled him across the ocean. He remembered the damp chill of Scotland that had taken his brothers, the shadow of tuberculosis that had loomed over his own lungs, and the desperate flight to the crisp, healing air of Brantford, Ontario. It was there, in a clearing in the woods of a new world, that the wire began to sing. Reflecting on his life's work, a faint smile touched his lips at the irony that defined his legacy. The The world hailed him as the father of the telephone, yet he had stumbled upon it while seeking something else entirely, a harmonic telegraph, a way to send multiple musical notes along a single wire. The human voice had been a beautiful accident, a discovery born of a mistake in frequency and vibration, and a patent that singular document, filed on a cold February morning in 1876, mere hours before his rival Elisha Gray arrived, had sparked decades of legal warfare. 600 lawsuits had been thrown against him, a barrage of paper and ink. Yet he had stood firm, never losing a major battle in the courts, even as the stress turned his hair prematurely white. But as the twilight deepened over the Nova Scotia estate, Alexander's thoughts were not on patents or glory. They were on the silence of those he loved. He thought of his mother, straining to hear through her ear tube, and of Mabel, his beloved wife, whose world had gone quiet after scarlet fever took her hearing at age 5. He had built bridges of copper and current, not for commerce, but to reach them. He had been a teacher of the deaf before he was an inventor, though his legacy there was complicated, marked by a rigid insistence on speech over sign, a philosophy born of a fear of a separate, deaf variety of the human race that haunted his sociological writings. He remembered the frantic, sweaty days of 1881, not in a lab, but at the bedside of a wounded president. He had constructed an electromagnetic metal detector in a feverish attempt to locate the bullet lodged in James Garfield's spine, despairing as the device failed, confused by the interference of the metal springs hidden deep within the president's mattress. He remembered the gentle touch of Helen Keller, who had placed her fingers on his lips to feel the vibrations of his soul, and whom he had guided toward the light of education. It was strange, he mused, how the device that conquered the world was one he banished from his own sanctuary. He refused to keep a telephone in his study, viewing its ringing as an intrusion, a thief of thoughts. He preferred the wind in his kites, the roar of the silver dart taking flight, or the spray of the HD4 hydrofoil cutting the water at 70 miles per hour. He was a man of motion, of air, and of water. But now the motion was ceasing. On an August day in 1922, the great inventor lay still. The complications of diabetes had finally claimed him, and as Mabel held his hand, whispering, "Don't leave me," he signed his final word into her palm. A simple, silent no. His passing sent a tremor through the world he had wired together. But the true tribute came not in words, but in their absence. During his funeral, a command was sent out across the vast, tangled network of lines that spanned the continent, from the busy exchanges of New York City to the rural outposts of the Midwest. Operators pulled the plugs. For one full minute, the entire telephone system of the United States and Canada was shut down. 13 million telephones went dead. The hum of commerce, the chatter of gossip, the urgency of business, all of it was severed. The wires that wrapped the globe in a web of constant noise fell silent, honoring the man who had given them a voice. It was a profound, unified hush, a global moment of reverence where the only sound was the wind moving through the trees and the gentle lap of water against the shore. The connection was broken, but the message was received. The inventor returned to the silence from which he came, leaving behind a world forever changed, forever listening. Good night.